in the place. When the girl and them pressing waist, I tell you, in the middle, I feel like we'll jam in the middle, right there. Start the trend, see me getting on with me friend and then. Kankatang, 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 kankatang.
Aaron Alexander, our distinguished panelists who have been quite patient. The Right Honorable Priest Kailash Leos, Dr. Marshall Emmanuel, Dr. Sharon Belmar George, Dr. Gerald Thompson, Mr. Dylan Norbert Inglis, CEO of the Regulated Substances Authority, our specially invited guests, members of staff of the RSA, members of the media. Good evening. My name is Phil Henderson, and I have the privilege of serving as your Master of Ceremonies this evening. Tonight we gather for diving into the weeds, faith, folklore, fact, fiction, and where St. Lucia fits in. For decades, cannabis in St. Lucia has lived in multiple spaces at once. It has existed in herbal practice, sacramental tradition, community folklore, underground economies, and increasingly within modern scientific research. Yet, rarely have we seen a structured national space where all of these dimensions can come together, be examined side by side. And this is why we are here. And I'm proud to be here with you. You all look very lovely. This event was conceptualized to move the conversation from assumption and emotion to fact and evidence, from stigma to structure, and from speculation to the RSA's favorite word, regulation. As St. Lucia advances its cannabis framework, the Regulated Substances Authority recognized that regulation without education creates uncertainty. Before full commercial expansion of the cannabis industry, we must ensure that the public fully understands the science, the safeguards, the concerns, the opportunities that are here. This evening is not designed to promote, neither Test, we good? Lovely. This evening was not designed to promote, neither was it designed to condemn. It is designed to inform. Testing, okay, I'm back. Media team, we good? We will explore the historical roots of cannabis in herbal and sacramental contexts. We will examine what modern science confirms, where research remains inconclusive. Testing. All right, thank you. I'm back. I also want to say, before I continue with my speech, thank you for your patience. Very generous of you to give us all this patience this evening, and you are very, very appreciated, all of you, even those who spoke to us one-on-one. As I was saying, we will explore the historical roots of cannabis in herbal and sacramental contexts. We will examine what modern science confirms, where research remains inconclusive, and where legitimate public health concerns must be addressed. We will hear about cannabinoid science, clinical applications, the risks to young people, which I know a lot of parents are concerned about, and how our regulatory model seeks to build an industry that is safe, sustainable, and economically resilient. Our hope is that you leave here not simply with opinions, but with understanding. Understanding of what the cannabis plant is. Understanding of what the cannabis plant is not. Understanding of where evidence supports treatment. Understanding of where caution must prevail. And understanding of how St. Lucia intends to position itself responsibly within a global industry. Later this evening, we will also be sharing a special release that further supports public education. And for those of you who would have been paying attention to our radio show this morning on the Wave, I announced what would be happening at 9 o'clock this evening. We have a very special gift that we've worked hard on, and we would love to share that gift with you towards the ending of this ceremony. With that, we begin. I now invite Shamil Joseph Pierre, General Counsel and Corporate Secretary of the RSA, and Aaron Alexander, President of ICAR, to deliver the invocation. Put your hands together, please.
Please stand for the opening prayer. Dear Lord and Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to gather here this evening, and we invite your presence into this space. We ask that you bestow wisdom, truth, and understanding on every panelist, speaker, and participant gathered here and following online. Father, we lift up every person who is working toward shaping and implementing a legislative regime for cannabis in our nation. Grant them discernment, integrity, strength, and courage. Help them to make decisions that are safe, responsible, and grounded in a genuine concern for the well-being of our people. May their choices reflect wisdom and foresight, protecting public health, safeguarding families, and promoting the common good. Lord, we ask that once this industry is launched, that participants will employ self-control and sound judgment. May wisdom guide our choices, and may our actions never bring harm to others. As we prepare to delve into this discussion, Lord, we ask that where there are differing perspectives, bring understanding. Where there are uncertainties, bring clarity. Where there are strong opinions, bring patience and mutual respect. Let this conversation be constructive, insightful, and beneficial to all here and listening virtually. May everything said and done here honor you and reflect your light. We commit this event and the future decisions that will follow into your hands, Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. We will now call on Mr. Aaron Alexander for the second prayer.
Thank you very much. Let us give thanks and praises. A bit of African spirituality. Afrocentric. Almighty Creator, Yah Rastafari. O Eli Lion, O El Shaddai, O Jihaji, O Shananja, Holy Emmanuel, and all our ancestors who fought for the liberation of the herb. We call upon you to be present amongst us this day and at this hour. Please endow us with your wise mind, knowledge, and understanding as we endeavor and embark upon this great reasoning today. As we discuss one of, in our view, your greatest and most highly sacred and spiritual herbs in your garden of creation. By your design, O thou Almighty, you said clearly that the grass shall be for the cattle and the animals, and the herb shall be for the healing of the nations and for the use of mankind. Yet, O thou Almighty, what great persecution and trials and tribulations we have faced for using this herb, which you, Almighty, gave to us. Through blood, sweat, and tears, and even in the face of being murdered, we have kept the faith and defended the holy herb for nearly 100 years now since its prohibition in 1937. Please, Almighty, grant the panelists here today the wise mind of Solomon to allow them to stay focused on the most relevant points when it comes to the cannabis plant. Keep them sharp, O thou Most High. We know manners maketh man, so please, Most High, cause us and grant us to behave ourselves in a wise and respectful and a disciplined manner this day. We are aware that there are those who are hell-bent against these proceedings. But Almighty, you did say unto us, and you did warn us about those who have drunk from the old wine, and rumor and propaganda, and there is no space for the new. We shall still embrace them, O thou Almighty. Once again, we ask of you for your guidance and your wise mind at this time. Bless this gathering, O thou Most High, and may these words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts to be found acceptable in thy sight. Thank you. Ja! Ja! Ja!
Thank you for that. You may be seated. Just to do a mic check, if you can hear me in the back, raise your hands, back of both sides. Thank you for that. I now invite the chairman of the Board of the Regulated Substances Authority, Mr. John Joseph, to deliver the welcome address. Mr. Joseph looking very dapper in his attire. Project your voice,
Greetings to all, and welcome to our evening session. I think some of the more senior ones among us would remember there was a Rastafari creative came up with a song, Police Mote Mon Jimmy. That was quite some time ago, and we're still in an era where the herb is criminalized, although there has been some amendments for personal use. So I think I really welcome everybody here this afternoon, because we need to have a very serious conversation as to where we go forward. We need to appreciate our ancestry, and we need to make decisions that will make us sustainable in a space we're actually quite new in. Cannabis has actually established itself, strangely enough, in North America, Canada, Europe, and in places where it's indigenous to ourselves, we're kind of getting at the back end. So there's a fair amount to do, there's a fair amount to understand, and I trust that all of us here will take that seriously, keep our minds open, and make wise decisions going forward, that we can show that we are serious about this, and eventually it'll become a cornerstone of our economy where it's sustainable and it's profitable and beneficial to all, and that we can all move our country forward together. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. I now invite the Honorable Minister John Paul Estefan to the stage.
Okay, all right. Good afternoon, everyone. Madam President of the Senate, Chair of the Board. Let me thank the board and the staff, the CEO of the Regulated Substance Authority, for putting together this activity this afternoon. This is a very, very important activity. As a minister in the Ministry of Commerce, and Commerce is the parent ministry for the Regulated Substance Authority, I had the privilege to present for first reading in the House of Parliament the bill, what we call the cannabis bill. And to go forward with that bill, there is need for us to have widespread discussion so that everybody understands what is it that we are doing. I heard the chairman of the board speaks about the suffering and the song Police Muti Bonjimi, which has been part of our history and our legacy for a while now. We need to change that going forward. I believe we have gotten to the stage where now, in terms of how we view the hub, we need to change that. And the government of St. Lucia is serious about moving forward with the legislation. But before we can do that, we need every St. Lucian to understand what is in the bill and how the bill can affect us. There are important considerations for us in terms of public health and safety. We need to ensure that our young people, they don't fall prey to the cannabis, and we have a system in place and policy in place that is robust enough to ensure that, hey, if you are below a certain age, that you cannot get involved in that. In terms of criminal justice reform, we have to look at that. I heard about people who have been persecuted for use of the herb, and we need to change that going forward. There is a lot of economic opportunity for the cannabis industry, and it is something that we have to regulate to ensure that large businesses don't take over, and then there is opportunity for the small man to make business out of the industry. In terms of medical access, and you will hear a lot about that later, for patients with epilepsy, chronic pain, and so on. In some parts of the world, the cannabis has been used to help these people. And what we need to ensure going forward, that we have things in place to help these people. So what we call for is a balanced path forward. So whether you support the legislation, decriminalization, or stricter regulation, we can agree that in terms of the policy, it should be evidence-based. We should have strong regulation and quality control. We should have research funding to understand long-term effects. We should have equitable licensing and social equity programs. And then we have youth prevention and education, impaired driving enforcement, and ongoing community support. So the effort, what we are doing here is not that we are endorsing the cannabis use. But what we want to do is to craft smart, compassionate policy that prioritize public health, justice, and community needs. So I welcome the discussion that we are about to have. I encourage participation, and I can tell you that the parent minister for the Ministry of Commerce, Honorable Ernest Haley, we are very, very excited to ensure that, hey, the second reading for the cannabis bill is done in Parliament, and we have the legislation going forward. So with these few remarks, I want to encourage the discussion, and I want to wish everybody a pleasant evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for those remarks, Mr. Minister. Before we move into the presentation section of this evening, the fun part, the part that you've all been here for, I would just like to apologize once again that we are still having some minor technical difficulties, which is why we don't have the running order up on the screen, and we would also have the bios and the presentations on the screen for you to follow along with as well. However, the presenters and panelists have been kind enough to disseminate that information with you straight off. So I will move to introducing our first presenter for the evening, where he will examine cannabis through multiple lenses: historical, scientific, medical, public health, and regulatory. If you didn't know, our first presenter this evening is Priest Kailash Leos, who will explore the historical story of cannabis use from ancient herbal traditions to modern sacramental practice. He is a renowned herbal physician, cultural ambassador, and founder of the Mount Kailash Rejuvenation Center, with over 2 decades of service in ancestral herbal medicine, plant therapeutics, and holistic wellness. He is also the originator of the theory of righteous entrepreneurship, the guiding philosophical and ethical framework upon which Mount Kailash Rejuvenation Center and all other ventures he leads are built. Recognized across the Caribbean for his deep mastery of indigenous healing traditions, he brings a clear and authoritative perspective to the historical, medicinal, and sacramental use of cannabis, bridging ancient ethnobotanical wisdom with modern herbal practice as an educator and cultural preservationist. Priest Kailash is known for presenting complex plant histories and sacred traditions with clarity, accuracy, and profound cultural integrity. Help me welcome the Honorable Priest Kailash.
Yes. Yes, give thanks. Give thanks for life and the mighty life giver. The protocol already established, but I still like to give thanks for the presence of the minister. He's gone already? He's gone? For a minute? He shouldn't even have left, not even for a minute. This is some very important discussions that we'll be having, and give thanks for the President of the Senate, Marshal Emmanuel, Dr. Marshal Emmanuel. Give thanks, my Lord, Honorable the CMO and our brethren from St. Vincent. Give thanks for all those of you who have been waiting for so long. And as a Rastafari, I was asked to present on the whole aspect of the history and the medicinal aspect of herb, and also the sacramental aspect of herb. I had a beautiful presentation with lots of pictures, because sometimes it is very difficult to understand that what we are talking about here in 2025, like we're looking at probably about 3,000 years before the Christian era, what you call BC. From 3,000 years, about 5,000 years ago, there was already medical manuscripts, specifically the Ebers papyri, that actually had many very detailed uses of how the herb cannabis could have been utilized medicinally. I'm talking about a plant that, if it is a woman had some gynecological problems, the Ebers papyrus would give specific instructions on how to crush the herb, mix it with honey, or do a vaginal insert. If it is that people had eye problems, I'm talking about 5,000 years ago. And right now we are in 2025, and we are still having discussions and still trying to convince people about the medical efficacy of the herb. After we move from Kemet, we look at historically the use of cannabis in places like China. So even like 2,700 years before the Christian era again, they just uncovered a tomb about a decade ago of a Caucasoid shaman who was buried in a province in China. That's 2,700 years. And in his possession, he had all different materials, but he had a big jar filled with preserved cannabis. Right? So ancestrally, historically, you also had, even within that same excavation, I'm talking about 2,700 years ago, more than that, where you had people sacramentally, when you have people being buried and they have over 13 cannabis plants that rest right across the physical structure as use of the passage through the ancestral realms. So it is critical that even if you're not seeing the photographs, I would make the presentation available so at least you could go to the references and to at least educate yourself. Because the conversation that we are having today, when it comes to, okay, priest, you want to talk about the medicinal benefits of herbs. You know, some people say, well, I was speaking to Dr. Sandrosi, but priest probably need to be more vocal, right? I feel that the herb itself has already done justice historically. So if we understand that, when it is that the herb was criminalized, before that, on all the pharmacopedias, I'm talking about the medical texts, all the medical texts within the Americas, within Europe, within India, Ayurvedic medicine, all the medical texts have recorded uses of cannabis. So now with all the AI and all the artificial intelligence, we have the opportunity whereby we could build upon the foundation of what the ancestors have done with cannabis, with herb. So nowadays, when we're at the Mount Kailash Rejuvenation Center, when it is that we are speaking to our clients about cannabis and the use of cannabis, I remember my own mother, when I grew my locks at the age of about 20, my own mother, she was so vocal about marijuana, you know. And then one day, my mother was suffering with asthma. And a concoction that they used was bay rum and cannabis. Bay rum comes from Dominica, right? So they soak the bay rum in the cannabis, and you utilize the cannabis to that concoction, that tincture, to fight asthma. So my mother stopped suffering from asthma, and I am there as a Rasta man, and I'm being persecuted for her. And one day, my mother has passed. She was smuggling a bottle of medicine to a friend of hers in England. And I'm looking at the medicine, and I'm seeing that that's my mother telling me about herb, you know, that she has a bottle with bay rum and marijuana soaked inside, sending to a friend in England to combat asthma. When I was a baby, I'm talking about locally in St. Lucia, I remember specifically that everyone gave up on me. They said, well, Priest is going to die. K, they called me K is going to die, and I was about months old. And my mother told me that my godfather, who had 3 plants of cannabis, that I'm talking about, that's like in 1977, you know, I was born in 1977. And they harvested the plant, boiled it, and they gave me the roots. And all my diarrhea and all my vomiting actually stopped. So medicinally, apart from everything that I have read in the academia, in the research about cannabis, I am a personal testament of what cannabis does. And being that, when we look at the whole framework of the criminalization, so you're looking at a herb that historically was looked at as something that binds communities together, a herb that ancestrally and spiritually we use to access the other realms of creation, sacramentally meditation, reasoning, a herb then that has been turned into a drug. But what we have to critically realize is that the foundation or the premise of criminalizing the cannabis was not because, well, when people smoke it, they die and they drop dead and all these different. It wasn't really a healthcare issue. It really was a control issue. So coming from the perspective of a Rastafari, as someone who has been arrested for cannabis, someone who, as a child, have witnessed people being shot on plantation and then being thrown at the back of the vehicle, the conversation about cannabis is very sensitive, and so I don't really argue with people about the use of cannabis. I don't really you won't see me protesting with a placard. You know, I feel that at the stage that we are specifically as a people, historically, sacramentally, and legally, we saw that the whole framework was changed towards criminalizing not the herb, but criminalizing people. So, sacramentally, as Rastafari, I specifically have not, I don't smoke spliff. I have not smoked a spliff for over, probably 2 decades. I don't smoke spliff over 2 decades. If I don't believe in burning paper. If it was my rules, then probably it would have been illegal to smoke a spliff, even the paper on the cigarette. So as a Rastafari priest, I would steam, meaning that the heat applied to the herb extract not just the cannabinoids, but the terpenes, the polyphenols, all the components of the herb, and I don't smoke. So we, on a sacramental level, it's not just about rolling something or doing something, but the man who rolls or burns the chalice or whatever levels that they utilize the herb, sacramentally, this for the Rastafari community is something that, I mean, when they say about, okay, well, police move them on Jimmy, I mean, someone could say that, I mean, you could repeat it as someone who did not go through the trauma, but even just repeating it on the stage might be traumatic for someone who actually went through the brutality. So medicinally, in the present time that we are living, when it comes to the utilization of cannabis, it is something that, I mean, we in the region, or in St. Lucia, we really have to try to just play catch up because we are still having public discussions. When we have so many scientific papers, so many documents of the benefits and all, and we're having discussions. And last year, I still had to pay bail at $48,000 for a Rastaman who was arrested for herb. You know, and then you still have people, you know, being arrested with guns and they get bail for $12,000. Still, the perception, even in this setting, we are still at a position where people are so afraid of even just endorsing cannabis. You know, well, I endorse marijuana. You know, I endorse it as a Rastafari. You know, I endorse it as someone who actually give it to my clients. We have a patient. I'm summarizing. I think my time is about almost up. We have a client. I think he's about a 6-month-old client. I remember going to the UE, and I saw Dr. Marshall in his lab, and he had a particular device, you know, and then he had his beaker on top of it and a magnetic stirrer, and he was just stirring something, and we were there for almost an hour. And I'm witnessing him just stirring, and then I asked him, what's that? And he told me, well, it's cannabis extract in rice bran oil that is given to a particular client for some level of examinations that a problem that the client had. And we have a young child, I think that he's about 5 or 6 or age, whatever age, that used to have all like 24 seizures. 24 it was, Mama? Over 24 seizures every single day. Imagine that you have a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old child that gets over 24 seizures every single day. And by just administering that rice bran and cannabinoid extract to that child, that was reduced to what, 3 seizures? 4 seizures every single day. And this has been for over what, 3-4 years. So personally, our personal experience with the herb as a Rastafari, utilizing it sacramentally, and also as someone who is in the craft and the art of healing, the benefits I see of utilizing the herb is just like when you have Mike Tyson in a ring fighting, you know, in his prime, and it's a knockout. You know, I strongly believe that we should have some proper dialogue with, as we are having today, with our CMO and the police and everyone involved. You know, because I remember getting arrested for a spliff. I remember the police throwing me down, and I had a bad knee that time and trying to kick my knees just for a spliff. And I just want to give 4 points of consideration in conclusion. In our view of what the reform effort's supposed to be like, because there was one thing that the minister actually did not mention. this was the aspect of what you call historic justice. So I say there needs to be historic justice. There is a public health issue. There is the cultural heritage issue. And also, you know, we must also correct historical misrepresentation. Our people not supposed to be afraid to be aligned with cannabis. So correcting what we are attempting to do now, correcting the injustices, is not anything new. It is for us now as a people to reclaim our history, because the use of cannabis over 5,000 years ago has been something that has been enshrouded or embedded within our healthcare system and also our sacramental or spiritual or divining essences in life. Give thanks. Give thanks, brother.
Thank you, Priest Kailash, for that wonderful presentation. I think many of us who sit here can attest to the personal testament that cannabis can provide when we have applied it in the right spaces and the right times, that some of us may have experienced healing, and I look forward to a regime where we can have many more testimonials like this. Is the audio good in the back? Just making sure. All right, lovely. Bear with us a few minutes. We are about to have the eats set up on my way to the left, so you can feel free to patronize. And we are working on the screen. So bear with me a few more minutes before we bring on our next presenter, who's very eager to share with you her findings. I will be with you again shortly. All right, like I promised, we'll be moving along. Slight change of agenda. We will now have the first CEO of the Regulated Substances Authority to give his presentation this evening while we await the screen. Dylan is a son of the soil. After completing his studies at the St. Mary's College and Sir Arthur Lewis Community College, respectively, he enrolled at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus, where he later obtained a Bachelor's of Law degree. He went on to pursue his legal education certificate at the Hugh Wooding Law School in Trinidad and Tobago, where he graduated with distinction before being called to the St. Lucian Bar in October 2011. Dylan joined the law firm of Theophilus, Pierre, and Mondesi later to become Lon Theophilus Chambers, where he frequently appeared before the Magistrates Court and High Court of St. Lucia. Dylan left private practice in 2015 to explore regulatory governance in the financial sector. Throughout 2016, Dylan served as a project manager and managing consultant for a mid-sized credit union. Dylan then migrated to Canada, where he served as a legal consultant. In 2019, Dylan returned to St. Lucia to serve as the legal officer for the Ministry of Commerce, International Trade, Investment, Enterprise Development, and Consumer Affairs. Later, reformed to the Ministry of Commerce, Manufacturing, Business Development, Cooperatives, and Consumer Affairs. Since his return to St. Lucia, Dylan has been called to the Bar of Guyana, served as a lecturer at the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College, became an accredited director, and founded and co-founded a number of personal private ventures. Dylan has also served in various capacities on a number of public, quasi-public, private and regional bodies, including the St. Lucia Cannabis Task Force, the St. Lucia Football Association Appeals Tribunal, ASTM Committee 34, the National Consumer Affairs Tribunal, and the Caribbean Cannabis Forum. Since 2020, he has been at the forefront of development, revision, and implementation of the regime for regulated substances, including cannabis and radiation. In December 2024, Dylan was appointed as the first CEO of the RSA of St. Lucia. At the RSA, he is tasked with implementing a regime for cannabis on the island of St. Lucia and revising and overseeing the regimes for radiation, alcohol, petroleum, explosives, pesticides, and toxic and hazardous chemicals. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hand together for Mr. Dylan Norbert Inglis, CEO of the RSA.
Good evening, everyone. The past few hours have not gone as planned for us, but we pivot often at the RSA. So let me wish everyone again a good evening. And let me start tonight with a quote, one that has been heard many, many times since we started this journey, and one that has been said at community engagements, stakeholder engagements, one that is and will continue to be said on the block, at the rum shops, and many other settings around the island. One that we can see on the almost every social media post that the RSA makes in the context of cannabis, and one I'm sure if you were to follow the live feed on YouTube right now has probably been posted already. Why the men just free up the weed? That's usually what we hear said to us at all of these settings. Now, the statement is often always followed by one or more caveats, issued either by the speaker or others in support of the statement. All they have to do is, suggesting it is as easy as plugging one hole, filling one gap, addressing one safeguard, one matter, and after that, everything flows. And you know what? In most instances, the single point that is being raised, all they have to do, the just that, is not wrong. All they have to do is make sure the people already in the industry don't get locked out. They have to be at the center of the whole thing. All they have to do is make sure the small man gets the support to survive in the industry. All they have to do is keep a little space for the Rastafari. Fair enough. Imagine for a minute that we listened, that the legislation was built on two pieces of legislation, not just one. A cannabis bill and an amnesty bill. The Drugs Prevention of Misuse Amnesty Bill, as it is called, and the Regulated Substances Cannabis Bill, as it is also called. The amnesty bill would give people who had been operating outside of the law a formal pathway to come in from the cold, to admit their involvement, and to receive, critically, an amnesty. Crucially, also to be recognized as legacy cannabis operators, not criminals with a past, operators with experience. And the cannabis bill, the second of the two pieces of legislation, then gave these legacy cannabis operators preferential treatment, not left them to join the line where they could fit in, but placed them at the front of it, with the creation of a license called the Traditional Cultivators License, a license just for them. With the Traditional Cultivators License and the dispensary licenses being issued to legacy operators, the intention would be to issue them at fees far lower than the new commercial entrants, because we recognize that they have already paid their dues, in some cases, literally, in fines and in years. And imagine as well if we could somehow work into the industry a central trading entity, a body that holds the exclusive right to distribute cannabis in St. Lucia, but that the legacy operators that I referenced earlier had to have an ownership stake in it. that you cannot build a CTE without them, that they were not optional, but that they were requirements. And imagine if you could recognize the legacy operators may have some challenges in meeting the physical security requirements set in the legislation and in the regulations. But instead of shrugging your shoulders and saying that they didn't make the grade, pun intended, that you permitted them to operate and gave them up to 4 years to meet the requirements. And another thing, the advisory committee, a body which sits at the heart of the industry and is how it will be governed. And it will include by law a representative of the Rastafarian community. Now that's an afterthought, but that's a named permanent seat at the table, so that the people who had been part of the plan's history in St. Lucia have the formal voice in how the regulations are shaped going forward. The thinking, processes, and mechanisms I have just outlined are not just fanciful, empty statements. I hope this sarcasm did not cause any offense or confusion. All of these matters were addressed in the industry we've developed and are now part of how St. Lucia fits these just that's into our industry. All they have to do is protect people from tainted and unsafe cannabis. This is one I actually take very seriously. So over the last week or two, I remember being at a gas station and overhearing some persons referring to a friend of theirs who had been given a black joint. I didn't even know that still happened. To those in the audience who may not know what a black joint is, I will spare you the disappointment of the definition. But to you and to everyone else, instances like that are not the only instances of tainted or unsafe product. Issues of pesticides, heavy metals, mold, animal particulate, and mycotoxins are real and live issues within the cannabis space. And I cannot overstate this enough. There is a major need for us to address these issues within the cannabis sector. It would be a shame for us to allow you to legally purchase a product from a legal seller, a product that was legally cultivated in a legal regime, only for that product not to be tested and expose you to a litany of things that you are not even aware of. When you buy a cannabis or cannabis product, you should know what they are, what is in them, how strong they are. And beyond that, you must know that the product is safe. That is what you paid for. It is going to cause the effect that you expect and nothing more. So the laws must and do provide for testing. They must and do provide for cultivation and harvesting practices. They must and do provide for packaging and labeling requirements. It isn't a cannabis thing. It's a commerce thing. It is what you expect of every product on your supermarket shelves, and more importantly, every product, every medicine in a pharmacy. And while we are on the point of general commerce, we've also heard people say, all they have to do is make the banks cooperate. Let people bank their money. Let people get loans for cannabis. Now, let me be honest on this point. It is still being worked on. Banking access for cannabis businesses remains a challenge, not just in St. Lucia, but across the Caribbean and indeed in many jurisdictions globally. What the RSA can do, and what we are doing, is work with a regulatory framework to give cannabis businesses the legitimacy that financial institutions need to engage them. A licensed, compliant, regulated business operating within a transparent seed-to-sale mechanism is a fundamentally different proposition to a bank than an informal operation. That is how you can address the just that people are bringing up. The legal foundation is what unlocks the financial conversation. It is what will empower the people of today and the economy of St. Lucia. And while on the point of the economy of tomorrow, let's talk about our tomorrow generally, our youth. All they have to do is protect the youth. Here is the data to go with. countries that have legalized cannabis, and now there are very many of them with many years of data, they have not, and I repeat, they have not seen an increase in cannabis use against any metric. This is not a youth crisis. The only demographic internationally that has seen an increase, a marked increase in use, is persons over the age of 60. That is largely older people accessing something for pain management and other wellness that was previously not available. Regulations do not open the door to young people. It actually closes it more firmly than prohibition ever did, because prohibition did not have an enforcement mechanism at the point of sale, but a licensed dispensary does. Our legislation is the only one in the Caribbean that allows two classes of cannabis. Class 1 cannabis, that allows you to purchase cannabis by way of, without a prescription, and Class 2 cannabis, which will require a prescription. Anyone over the age of 21, including the old lady who can benefit from cannabis cream for her knees, need not visit a practitioner and obtain a prescription for her to get that Class 1 product, which may be able to address her issue. But under 21, any person who can benefit from cannabis use can still access and use cannabis if it is prescribed by a medical doctor. Selling to a young person, giving cannabis to a young person, using cannabis in the presence of a young person, all of these things will be criminal offenses with real penalties. That is how we address that, just that point. All they have to do is let the Rastaman use his herb for sacrament. Done. Some may have missed the section of the bill that provides for non-commercial sacramental cannabis, or the entire set of regulations dedicated specifically to sacramental cannabis, because the intention was never to prevent the tenets of worship. It was never to prevent that, but to accept and identify the rights of persons to use the plant sacramentally. We had to distinguish it from the commercial sector. It was different, and it always should have been treated differently. So over the last 3 years, 3.5 years, what have we been doing? We've been tracking just this and just that, and fitting them into the legislation as to how it could have found its way before Parliament. So yes, the bills are a little bit longer than that found in other jurisdictions, but that doesn't mean that it is more restrictive. If you dare to read, to compare, it actually means that it has more details, it has more exemptions, more exceptions, a little more ingenuity. So let me give you a quick picture on the legislation, what it actually looks like, because as I said, it is more complex than a lot of people realize. So the Regulated Substances Cannabis Bill has 9 categories for medicinal cannabis licenses, not 1, 9. Both indoor and outdoor cultivation at micro, small, medium, and large scale, processing, transport, import, export, research, consumption spaces, experience licenses. Yes, we actually have an experience license for businesses that want to build legal cannabis experience for visitors to the island, and a treatment center license for medical facilities. Industrial hemp has its own separate license categories covering cultivation, processing, import, export, transport, and research within the hemp field. The distinction is not based on the potency, as is usually the case, but is based on how it is being used. So if it is being consumed by humans, it is cannabis, and will be treated as such and tested as such. If it is an industrial crop intended for industrial purposes, it is industrial hemp. And industrial hemp opens a different set of economic possibilities, from textiles to biodegradable packaging to construction materials, and our industry is not limited in that regard. There is a seed to sale tracking system, meaning every plant, every product, every batch is documented from the moment it is in the ground to the moment it reaches the consumer. The RSA is developing and will apply a medical cannabis stamp on every product as evidence that it has been through the system and there is no guessing what you are getting. The medical pathways are also clear. 29 qualifying conditions have been listed in the bill, from cancer to HIV, PTSD, epilepsy, autism, Parkinson's disease, pain, hypertension. Even animals can benefit from cannabis use. Yeah, they're products for animals. Now, having heard some of the facts, and we'll discuss a little bit later the folklore, we'll hear some of the fiction, we've already discussed the faith. Some may still be wondering where we fit in. Now, whether you are here tonight as a farmer, an entrepreneur, a medical professional, a legacy operator, or simply someone who has been following the story, coming out to the physical settings, or joining us virtually, here's what I want you to walk away with. Know what you are allowed to do. The bill is not yet passed. You are currently allowed to cultivate 4 plants per household and possess 30 grams of cannabis on your person. That is the baseline. When the law is passed, this hard line will remain. Above 4 plants, you will need to have a license. So know that line. Know which license is yours. Look at the schedule to the bill. As I said earlier, there are various categories, from small traditional cultivators, licenses for large indoor and outdoor operations. There's licenses for processors, transporters, researchers, experienced operators. Find the one that fits you, and more importantly, fits your resources. Not just the one that sounds the most impressive. And for the medical professionals, prepare yourself. To prescribe cannabis, you will need a certificate of registration from the RSA, yes, but you will also need to go beyond that. There is a need for you to understand the plant, the products, the illnesses, the possible treatments. Your patients will be asking you about this, and you need to be ready for the conversation. St. Lucia stands at a pivotal point. As the RSA, our mission is not merely to act as a gatekeeper, but to serve as a bridge. We are building an ecosystem where safety meets opportunity. We are taking all the parts, all of the comments, all of the caveats, all of the just that's, and we are building them into the architecture of this industry, one clause at a time. So when someone asks you again, why the men edges free up the weed? I want you to have an answer. A real cannabis industry is not simple. It's more than just one thing. It is not created by chance. It is created by systems. Licensing rules, quality standards, waste logistics, finance rails, training, traceability, institutional support. Tell them it was never just one thing. It is how all of those, just this and just that, fit together. Tell them it was about the amnesty, about the legacy operators, the cooperatives, the testing, the youth protections, the dispensaries, the Rastafarian seat at the table, the medicinal pathways, the industrial hemp opportunities, and yes, the ongoing conversation about banking. Tell them the RSA heard every single, all they have to do is, and we address that. We address this. Not to be wordy or to be complex, but to free up the weed, the only way that made sense to us. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation, Dylan. Over the past year, the RSA has gotten this repeated question: just do it, just free up the weed, just pass it, just legalize it. All you have to do is, if was me, I pass it already. If was me, I do it already. If was me. And it is a reasonable perspective to have. However, for those who think that the RSA and by extension St. Lucia is late to the party, we have spent a good amount of time, effort, and resources collaborating with our brothers and sisters, and I mean that from around the region, and that is evident based on who we have here with us tonight. And so, for those who feel that we are late to the party, we beg to differ and say there's no better time than now to move to this industry based on all the knowledge that we have acquired so far. We have the knowledge of the islands who have legalized. We have the perspective of those who have decriminalized. We have the practices and traditions of the international community who have been very gracious and shared with us and continue to train and assist us to ensure that the Helen of the West puts together a formidable legislation and a formidable regime. And if I can borrow from the RSA's motto, that would ensure safety, certainty, and success. There's no better time than now to have these conversations, and I thank you for sitting here with us this evening. I would now like to invite our next presenter, who would be giving her perspective on where she thinks we fit in, or where we should fit in the medicinal cannabis industry. Please put your hands together for Dr. Sharon Belmar George, CMO of St. Lucia.
Good evening, everyone. Okay. Although I will adopt the protocol that was established, I want to recognize the President of the Senate, Honorable Alvina Reynolds, the Board of Directors of the Regulated Substance Authority, the team from the Regulated Substances Authority, and all of you who are here this evening. So my presentation this evening is really to give the focus on the part of the Ministry of Health, Wellness and Nutrition. But before I start, I want to acknowledge the efforts of Mr. Dylan Norbert Inglis for the collaborative efforts that he took in getting where we are right now with the legislation. And the Ministry of Health is one of those who he has worked closely with in ensuring that some of our concerns are addressed. And I also want to recognize some members of the team who worked together with him. That is Mrs. Natasha Lloyd-Felix from the Substance Abuse Secretariat, and also our Chief Pharmacist, Ms. Astrid Mondesi. Before I start, will I get PowerPoint? Does it look like I will get my PowerPoint presentation to make it easier? Before I go into the medicinal cannabis, I think it's important that you understand the focus with which I'm presenting. I want to just very briefly give an idea of the vision and the mission of the Ministry of Health and where our focus is in relation to cannabis. It's coming on, the presentation? All right, no problem. So my PowerPoint will actually come on very soon, but I will start so I don't keep you waiting any longer. So based on our old strategic plan, the vision of the Ministry of Health is to obtain optimal wellness within the entire population by increasing access to affordable, good quality health care. Our mission being to lead through advocacy, policy direction, regulation, delivery of accessible, comprehensive quality health and social services using the most cost-effective mechanism. So the focus for us at the Ministry of Health is wellness, health, prevention of diseases, mental wellness, physical wellness, treatment, rehabilitation, care support. Our focus is not about being punitive action. It's not about enforcement. It's really about the best health and wellness, the best outcomes for every St. Lucian on island. In my presentation, I will give the public health context of health risk behaviors, an introduction to medical cannabis and its relevance to healthcare, the documented medicinal value, thank you, and recommendations from a health perspective for safe implementation and patient services access and education. When we speak of a health risk behavior, we refer to any action or pattern of behavior that increases a person's likelihood of developing diseases, injury, disability, or premature death. In simple terms, it's something that can harm your physical, mental, or social well-being. Some of the examples include the excessive alcohol consumption, smoking or tobacco use, drug misuse, unhealthy diet, that is high sugar, salt, or fat intake, physical inactivity, unsafe sexual practices, reckless driving, just to name a few. I thought it very important that we go through some of our health behaviors on island to put this into context, because there is a thinking that we as health professionals put an extra emphasis on smoking and cannabis and not on the other unhealthy risk behaviors. So if you go through and if you've been monitoring our information, there are a number of unhealthy behaviors that we constantly discuss, provide information, and target our population. We are very data-oriented at the ministry, and our interventions, our programs, they're targeted looking at the data that comes out of our patient care. One of the areas that we do our surveys is a behavior risk factor survey. We conducted one in 2012. Our last survey was in 2020. And we look to see how the population behavior, because it will predict the type of chronic illnesses that we have to prepare the sector for. Of importance to us is alcohol use. We noted 61.9% reported drinking at least a standard drink in the last 30 days. And when we compare it to that behavior in 2012, it was an increase. 31.3% drank once a month. And some of the data is here, you'll see. And also tobacco use. We saw that 12.9% reported current tobacco use, 8.5% indicating daily smoking. And we saw, as we expected, an increase in males. Of this data, 25.2% was males and 3.4% females. We also monitor closely overweight and obesity levels in the population, raised blood pressure, and also raised blood glucose. So all of those risk factors are significant to us. I will go at this point into the introduction of medical cannabis and its relevance in healthcare. Medical cannabis refers to the use of cannabis or its cannabinoids, such as tetrahydrocannabinol, that's the THC, or cannabidiol, which is CBD, for medical purposes. Now, it is used to alleviate symptoms or treat certain medical conditions under the supervision of trained healthcare professionals and guided by a therapeutic plan. Now, this is different to the medicinal cannabis, which is what we call cultural or medicinal image, where there is a regulated preparation or production environment and there's standards on quality assurance and traceability. For conventional medicine, we use scientific evidence. For alternative or herbal medicine, that is the use of plants, roots, leaves, flowers, or seeds to improve health care or to treat illnesses. Generally, it's not rigorously tested for safety or efficacy or standards, and the dosage may vary based on the practitioner. There is also a difference between medicinal cannabis and recreational cannabis. Medicinal cannabis uses controlled strains and doses, targets specific health conditions, and the treatment is guided by health professional. But recreational cannabis, there's no documented safeguards for recreational use. There's a risk of mixing with other unknown substances during preparation. And there's also the possibility of newer, less invasive modes of administration leading to potential overconsumption. For example, the edibles and the vapes may contain as much as 100 doses in one vape cartridge. In line with the bill, and I think Mr. Norbert explained, the Class 1 medical cannabis, which is mostly the creams and other products, whereas the Class 2 medical cannabis, it is with a prescribed amount of THC and can only be obtained with a prescription under that section. I won't go into detail as he has already explained it. Medical cannabis products, they should be the products with market authorization to ensure quality and also standardization. So these are some of those. Go on to the next slide. The Epidiolex, Marinol, Syndros, Sesamet. And we have to ensure that manufacturing of products locally must have the strict standards to ensure quality and also to accurately determine the concentration of those drugs and their purity levels. These are the acceptable evidence-based dosage forms of medicinal cannabis. So we have tablets for the oral form, capsules, gelatinous cubes, liquid suspension, transdermal preparation, sublingual preparation, and topical preparation. These are the acceptable evidence-based dosage forms for medicinal cannabis. I also want to point out, and I was quite pleased when Preskelaj pointed out that his medicinal cannabis is not the smoked product. The smoking method is not efficient and also potentially harmful delivery method. The dosage administered by smoking is related to the depth and the duration of the inhalation. So it's very difficult to standardize. Smoked cannabis is not considered ideal for medicinal treatment for a number of reasons. The first one, it produces tar. The primary cancer-causing tar is benzopyrene, carbon monoxide, and carcinogens, similar to tobacco smoke. The smoking can irritate the lungs and worsen asthma or bronchitis. Smoking also delivers an uncontrolled dose of THC. It also raises the heart rate and may affect the blood pressure. So dose standardization in a smoking form is a huge challenge. So when we're speaking of medicinal cannabis, it's really the forms that I had indicated on the slide, and it's not a smoked product. There are various strains of cannabis. Each of them have their own unique chemical composition and potential medicinal properties. There is indica, which is mainly for relaxing and sedating effects. There is sativa, which is typically energizing and uplifting. There is ruderalis, which is a less potent of the THC component. You also have hybrid strains that are bred to combine the characteristics of both the indica and also the sativa varieties. There are also CBD dominant strains that contain higher levels of CBD and lower levels of THC. And there's also THC dominant strains with higher levels of THC and lower levels of CBD. And there are different benefits for the different strains. The research also shows that the data, these categories, they're not as prescriptive as you might think, and they're not as consistent as well. Some may look different and grow differently, and it's more useful to the cultivators. I will just briefly go into what is some of the evidence-based and the documented medicinal value of cannabis. Pain relief for chronic pain, especially for end-stage cancers, nerve pain, and arthritis. That's more difficult to treat with your regular anti-inflammatory drugs. Gastrointestinal, to reduce nausea, vomiting, especially during chemotherapy, and can also be used to stimulate the appetite. The breeze is just ridiculous. Neurological as well, for the reduction of muscle spasms in multiple sclerosis, and also for the management of rare forms of epilepsy. There's also documented mental health treatments for the reduction of anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorders as well, specifically the CBD, and also to manage insomnia, although it may also worsen the anxiety. There's anti-inflammatory properties as well, and also to lower the eye pressure in glaucoma. Now, as much as generally, the CBD tends to be non-intoxicating, calming, anti-seizure, and the THC, psychoactive, pain-relieving, appetite-stimulating, and anti-nausea. The CBD alone appears a much safer and non-intoxicating, especially for persons who may be under 25 years. Most of the medicinal products that are on the market balance the two components. There's one, yes, sir. Nice. Thank you. There's one limitation to cannabis use though. Generally, it's not seen as a cure, but it's more useful for symptom management and not disease reversal or cure. Some of the factors that influence the side effects of cannabis on an individual, and one of the things that you hear quite frequently, some persons will say, I've been smoking for 10 years and I'm okay, or I've been smoking for 20 years and I'm doing well, whereas someone else may start to utilize cannabis in various forms and may end up with one of the mental health complications. So it depends on a lot of things, your body's interaction, how you will interact with it. The potency of the cannabis, the route of administration, the smoking technique, the dose, the setting, the user's past experiences, and also the health condition of the user or any pre-existing health conditions that may exist. I will go through some of the public health concerns, and Mr. Norbert Inglis and his team have been working with the Ministry of Health to ensure that a lot of the concerns are addressed in the bill. One of them is memory impairment, reduced focus and reaction time. THC may trigger anxiety, psychosis in certain individuals. The effect, especially if it's a smoked product on the lungs, that is COPD. And it's one of the issues which we have been managing. We've been seeing increased COPD and the effect on the health system, where we noted increases in persons being admitted just because they were oxygen dependent. The other effects on the lungs include bronchitis and emphysema. Also, the non-regulated use and its effects, especially for the more vulnerable, that is those that are under 25 years old, pregnant women, and those with respiratory compromised conditions. The neurological concerns would be the under 25 brain that is not fully developed. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for decision making, impulse control, and planning. The memory and learning centers, the emotional regulation centers are also affected. The THC interacts directly with the endocannabinoid system, which affects the maturity of these areas. So the age of utilization of cannabis is extremely important. These effects are worsened with frequent and heavy use or the high potency THC products. I will zoom in precisely on the effects of cannabis on the young brain. And we in medicine, we call it under 25 years because up to 25 years of age, the brain is not fully developed. And any product which interacts or affects the brain would then affect the full development of the brain, leading to some of the issues that we note. The changes in brain development, that is the neural connections, are altered in areas related to judgment and emotional control. And if started early, these changes may become permanent. memory and learning, the short-term memory is reduced. There's reduced academic performance, slower learning, attention and motivation is affected, there's difficulty concentrating, and motivation is reduced. The mental health risks, there's a high risk of anxiety and depression, the increased risk of psychosis, of schizophrenia, especially from early use, or if there's a family history of mental illness. There's also the risk of addiction. Persons aged 25 years are 2 to 4 times more likely to develop addiction as compared to if use is started after 25 years of age. And teens who use regularly may become dependent. The other concern is driving under the influence, or the use of heavy machinery as well. For us locally, that is on a national level, we lack the data. When you look at other countries, one of the countries that have a lot of data is Jamaica, where after fatal accidents, because they do testing for alcohol, for cannabis, and for other drugs, there's numerous research papers which indicate what percentage during various periods of time in Jamaica at the hospitals, and also what levels of whether it be cannabis, alcohol, or other drugs may have influenced the accident that you see. The data out of Jamaica shows there's a greater influence of alcohol, followed by cannabis, and then other drugs in almost all of the papers. So we are concerned with the low regulation already existing with tobacco and alcohol. And we are also concerned about the involvement of also cannabis, including the possible impact on crime. We also note it affects the reaction time and also your perception while under the influence. We lack data on the actual utilization of our population for cannabis. We know anecdotally that the percentage is high. It's used through various ages, but we do not have enough data to know what the exact utilization patterns within St. Lucia is. So we have concerns on the effect of patient safety and public safety, and it's important that there be adherence and guidelines into the use of medicinal cannabis to reduce the risk to users and to the population. So I'll go through some of the recommendations that we have. One of the largest risk factors leading to the use and the misuse, abuse, or addiction of any substance is the availability. We have to ensure that we have a robust public health campaign to discourage the youth and the more vulnerable of our population. So there must be enough public and patient education and counseling. We must ensure that whatever we produce is evidence-based, and also the products that are being used, that there's evidence-based on their use, that there's compliance with the regulations and standards, integration with healthcare providers as needed, public health and safety advocacy, and we have to ensure that the social systems that support holistic implementation are also in place. One of the areas that we would definitely need strengthening for would be the Turning Point Rehabilitation, which has a capacity of 10 beds. We need to ensure that there is sustainable, continuous research and also professional development. There must be research in all aspects of cannabis, from our national usage patterns, the epidemiology, the psychological effects, pharmacological, and also the economic potential. There must be responsible public, patient, and health professional education. We have to ensure that there is public health initiatives related to cannabis use, the public education campaigns, support services for individuals with cannabis addiction or misuse. For patients, there must be education and counseling, and guidance by providers for the management of misuse and abuse of medical cannabis products. And also building up patient competence and self-management. On the level of healthcare professionals, we have to ensure that all levels of health professionals are educated and trained in the prescribing of cannabis. Presently, our health sector, when we look at conventional medicine and our alternative medical providers, there's a level of division which exists, and there's a place for every type of health practitioner in medicine. So these are one of the areas that we definitely need to bridge the gap on. When we look at some areas such as Cuba, where I did my medical practice, it does not exist in isolation, where one set of practitioners will say, don't use the medication from a different type. And this has created a lot of poor patient outcomes within our population. I'll give you a simple example. You go to the physician for a sprain or an injury to your foot, and the order in which it is done is important. You choose to go to a conventional physician who would do the necessary examination, do the necessary diagnostics. For example, if an x-ray is needed, let us say you diagnose of a sprain of that ankle. So just as you are prescribed, for example, diclofenac for the pain and swelling, in a region such as Cuba, where there is holistic health management, you'd be given a prescription for probably massage or acupuncture or some other type of herbal medicine to assist with the pain and swelling. So it's not one type or the other. It's bringing it together and also understanding our culture. What we've done a lot of is to isolate our patients if they don't believe in one type of medicine, but it has to be done properly. It has to be clear which type of practitioner is for treatment and cure, which medication is to treat symptoms, and it has to be utilized properly. There are certain herbs that are just for symptom management and not to cure the illness. Many times we may manage the patient, have the patient go through a longer period of illness if they are not given a cure. So it's important for us to really bridge that gap between our different type of practitioners to ensure we provide holistic care to our patients and not care that they may not believe in or care that they may not actually manage or actually take seriously. So these are some of the things which we definitely have to look at, and we have to ensure, I just want to, in closing, to remember that above all, we do no harm. Our role is about healing, it's about treatment, but we have an obligation to ensure that we protect the most vulnerable of our population, and especially the under 25 years, our pregnant patients, patients who may already have a comorbidity. So it's extremely important that the information that is provided to the public is evidence-based and is backed by proper research. Thank you. I think that's it.
Thank you very much. Can I get another round of applause for the Chief Medical Officer? I'm also very happy to say that if you could see, our screen is back on. So I'm very happy about that. So later we will invite the Honorable Priest Kailash to revise a piece of his presentation to ensure that you get that information. And just to summarize Madam CMO's presentation, this is why we decided to have this conversation, not so that you have one school of thought and combating another school of thought, but that you have medicinal cannabis and her perspective and how she sees it from her traditional medicinal side. But then we also have schools of thought from other like-minded but albeit different individuals and how they can see a regime benefiting the country or the countries. I would now take this time to shift from medicinal science to plant science by inviting Dr. Marshall Emmanuel, a senior lecturer, researcher in the Department of Life Sciences at the University of the West Indies, Mona Campus, Jamaica. He is the principal investigator of the Life Science Cannabis Research Group. His research team conducts research in cannabis reform policy for the Caribbean region and the application, efficacy, and quality assurance of tropical horticulture for the production of cannabis sativa. He collaborates with the Humboldt Seed Company in the development of cannabis germplasm suited for equatorial cultivation. His research group has also received grant funding from BioBuzz, Worldwide Organics, in advancing sustainable and environmentally friendly practices for cannabis production. Dr. Emmanuel is the vice chair of the Bureau of Standards Jamaica Cannabis Technical Committee for development of standards for the Jamaica cannabis industry. He was appointed technical advisor consultant for the government of Dominica and St. Christopher and Nevis for the establishment and development of the regulated cannabis industries. Dr. Emmanuel was listed in Leaf Nation 2024 Impact List as one of the individuals making an impact in the cannabis world. Put your hands together for Dr. Marshall Emmanuel. I would also like to take this time to invite you to get some eats from the side over there.
Greetings, everyone. It's indeed a pleasure to be here with you all this evening. Particularly, I have special thanks to be in the OECS, particularly knowing that I'm from Dominica, so I'm very elated to be able to contribute my expertise and experience with you all today. Today, my presentation is going to be focused on understanding the quality assurance, particularly within the cannabis supply chain. And this is very important to ensure environmental stewardship and public health and safety is being administered throughout the supply chain. How do I move this? Hold on. Sorry about that. How do I click? No, this. Right, so cannabis, as we know, has a very long Malangal history in terms of Caribbean development. Cannabis has been part of our Caribbean reality from the inception of the 1600s, where the Spaniards came here in terms of introducing cannabis as hemp for introduction to, in terms of repairing their ship sails, in terms of using cannabis as a corderage. And then the colonial prohibition started in the 1900s, particularly in the 1913, where cannabis was pretty much criminalized. But during the emancipation of the slave trade, we saw where the indentured laborers were introduced to the Caribbean region, and that saw companies importing cannabis from southern India for the use of the indentured laborer population. And what is known that in the arrival of the indentured labor population, commingling was not something that was pretty much observed. So we saw that the interaction of African slaves and indentured Indians really partaked in the smoking of cali weed after a day's work on the slave plantation. And this saw a fusion of culture taking place, which sort of transitioned cannabis into the African populace. And today, we see where that has birthed the movement known as a Rastafari movement that really embraces a ganja as a sacramental plant. And we could see the connotation ganja being associated with that Indian preference. So So that promulgation in terms of cultures is really important to understanding the sort of persuasive views that we see in terms of cannabis usage today. So cannabis being an indicator species for the Caribbean region has long influence and culture within our demographics. So today, looking at the current legal landscape surrounding cannabis, we see where almost every CARICOM country has engaged in some form of cannabis relaxation in terms of policy. We see where Jamaica was the first in 2015, and as recent as in 2026, we see where Grenada decriminalized cannabis. What this status presents is that we have not taken a cohesive approach towards cannabis reform policy, where some countries have been decriminalized, some have instilled medicinal cannabis bills, and some has been able to incorporate some aspect of religious freedom and social equity programs. So we would like to see more coherence in terms of cannabis policy, because particularly from the investor confidence coming out from the first world, the Caribbean region is perceived as a single trading bloc in terms of advancing cannabis to these jurisdictions. So individualizing the approach to policy is not something that particularly interests that in investor confidence. We have seen where we have 7 cannabis licensing authorities have been established throughout the region thus far, and what this demonstrates is that the ministries that house these authorities, they tend to vary, such as we see Jamaica, it being housed in the Ministry of Investment and Commerce, similar to like St. Lucia, and that pretty much points to a sort of investment confidence to attract foreign investment to develop the sector. But in many jurisdictions, we see it being placed in the Ministry of Agriculture, and this is important because cannabis is an agricultural commodity where horticulture biomass is pretty much the raw material that fuels the supply chain. We see where Antigua has placed it in the Ministry of Justice and Legal Affairs. So this shows that the differences that has been presented in terms of reform policy, but cannabis reform policy, particularly in the Caribbean region, must sit on 3 main pillars. How does the Caribbean integrate into the global medicinal cannabis sector? How does the Caribbean address social equity and restorative justice issues? And how do you provide religious freedom and sacramental use for the Rastafari community who actually patronizes cannabis as a holy sacrament? So when we take a look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, we are building a more sustainable and equitable future for the Caribbean region. We see where cannabis fits into many of these SDG goals, such as decent work and economic growth. So every Caribbean model creates jobs, from cultivation to dispensing to manufacturing to research. We see where St. Vincent and the Grenadines has demonstrated in the medical cannabis bill the potential for exportation. We see where Jamaica has been able to demonstrate that sort of cultural leverage in terms of advancing cannabis policy forward. So we see where St. Lucia can definitely benefit from some of these prospects. We see where the SDG Goal 10, where reduced inequalities, such as where Antigua has been able to integrate some form of sacramental rights and social equity programs within their legal framework, and Jamaica has created certain tier systems to reduce barriers for entry in terms of small in terms of small farmers. And this means that ensuring both sacramental rights and economic access is presented to the marginalized communities. We see where SDG 12, where responsible consumption and production, where standards and framework ensures public health and safety throughout administering cannabis to the wider population. We also see where Barbados particularly emphasizes on a more pharmaceutical quality grade cannabis that really suffice that fact that cannabis is a medicinal prospect and provides therapeutic benefits. So St. Lucia has a unique opportunity to benefit from these experiences in terms of choosing sustainable cultivation from the start. We also see where SDG 15, where life on land in small developing island states look to sustainable agriculture as not an option, but as an essential tool for driving climate resilience and environmentally friendly programs in terms of farming practices. So the Regional Sustainable Development Goals opportunity presents for each opportunity and each jurisdiction to learn from in terms of Caribbean nations collectively advancing these global goals while building industries suited within their unique contexts. So looking closer at the cannabis plant, we always know that we have heard the notions in terms of, next slide please. We have always understood that cannabis indica, cannabis sativa, but in terms of those has been terminologies that has been developed based on cannabis prohibition to understand from a consumer point of view, but from the real taxonomic point of view, it really has no relevance in terms of administering cannabis as a therapeutic substances. These morphological characteristics, such as narrow-leaf drug types to my right-hand side and the broadleaf drug types to my left-hand side, is pretty much the morphological characters which are suited based on latitude of these plants to express their potential, to express their genetic potentials. And it is well known that cannabis sativa, in terms of the taxonomic definition, speaks of cannabis that does not necessarily produce psychoactive substances or cannabinoids. It's cannabis that's pretty much used for coverage and fiber, and these sativa narrow-leaf plants do demonstrate that plants evolve based on different latitude, these various morphological characteristics, but this has practical implications for sustainable cultivation, because if we look at the narrow-leaf drug types, which is generally considered the equatorial morphological characteristics, and the hue in terms of the green hue tends to be much lighter green versus the broadleaf drug types, which have a very darker hue, which is more suited for temperate cultivation. And this speaks to the fact that the plant in the equatorial climate is there to mitigate the effects of solar radiation by having a lighter green and a smaller leaf area index compared to the broadleaf drug cultivars, which are very dark green and very large in terms of that leaf area. So this actually poses challenges, because in today's context, where hybrid cultivars tend to be preferred in terms of the consumption market, and in an equatorial climate, we see where our heirloom and narrow-leaf drug types are slowly being extinct, particularly in places like Jamaica, where it's very hard to find a true equatorial plant. And my research has definitely demonstrated that the water use efficiency, the fungal presence of these broadleaf drug types does pose challenges based on management in terms of cropping or practices, where higher use of pesticides, higher use of fungicides, and higher use of water efficiency is being used to grow these temperate drug types in our equatorial climates. So when we take a closer look at cannabis germinoplasm, we know that in the 1960s to the 1980s, the actual Caribbean region developed international reputation for supplying cannabis to these metropolitan countries, and it was solely due to the presence of landrace cultivars or heirloom, varieties that evolved and acclimatized within the Caribbean biogeography. And these narrow-leaf drug types, which are indica plants producing cannabis, have a much longer flowering time and are more intelligent in mitigating effects of our climate, such as willing to close their stomatas through the hotter part of the day. So there is an efficiency in terms of the cultivars which we used to have here, and these are slowly being lost via cross-pollination and the increase of these temperate hybrids entering our tropical shores. And this basically happened for practical reasons, because what happened is during the war on drugs era, these plants would finish at 17 feet tall, would take 17 weeks in terms of flowering, and it was very easy for drug enforcement to spot these particular cultivars. So what happened is the first set of temperate genetics came into the Caribbean in the late 1980s, early 90s, and this saw where we don't have the long summer days, so the plant cannot vegetatively grow and increase biomass. So in terms of from seed to harvest would take as short as 8 to 10 weeks, and farmers saw that as a practical solution to be able to hide, to make the crop more inconspicuous in terms of law enforcement, and to have a faster turnaround time in terms of harvesting genetics. So we see that as a issue that really took place that has decimated our original heirloom cultivars, which has very significance in terms of breeding modern day hybrids, which is suited for our equatorial climates with less carbon footprint in terms of production. So hybridization is simply the crossing of two inbred varieties to create new actual cultivars of unique characteristics such as color, smell, and flavor. And these methods do require several generations and competence to ensure their stability in terms of expression of morphological and phytochemical constituents. And this is a particular strain that I developed with the Humboldt seed company, which is called the Caribbean Queen, and it's currently being grown in Thailand, in Africa, in Central America, and the Caribbean. And this strain has a unique advantage for the cultivator, particularly with reducing the efficiency in terms of dependence on energy consumption. So you could grow this particular cultivar without supplemental lighting. You would still get commercial yields, and the potency, the phytochemical constituents would meet a sort of commercial demand both locally and internationally in terms of the perceived constituents that modern day cannabis has. So when we look at the foundation in terms of quality assurance, we understand that it begins with the propagation material. Cannabis, you have 3 different types of propagation. You have the seeds, which is sexual propagation, where varieties and strains include based on the breeding program. We also have clones, which is asexual propagation, which pretty much replicates a same genetic constituent consistently. And we have in vitro production, which is pretty much tissue culture, where we could use a single cell from a plant to cultivate many plantlets. In vitro propagation does have an advantage, because we could actually clean up certain cultivars from diseases and viruses which are somewhat prevalent in our local germ plasm cultivars. So there are 4 different types of cannabis seeds. Next slide, please. There are 4 different types of cannabis seeds. There are regular seeds, which would be mostly accustomed in terms of cultivating here locally. And what these regular seeds present is that you will germinate plants and have both male and female plants. But this also poses serious challenges to sustainability in terms of cultivation, because think of it, a farmer has to germinate twice as much seeds, clear as twice as much land, use twice as much water to ensure that he culls other male plants upon sexual maturity and maintain female plants. But more so, what we have seen is that the farmer is able to cull the pure male plants, and he is unable to see the hermaphroditic plants that demonstrate monoecious characteristics of male and female plants in the same plant. And this happens, so if the farmer continues germinating those and actually collecting these hermaphroditic seeds that we see 99% of farmer presents his cannabis, it tends to be pollinated, and pollination has known to decimate the phytochemical constituents and the therapeutic value as low as 50% once the plant is pollinated. So we have developed techniques to eliminate the Y chromosome during breeding techniques, and focus on producing XX chromosome plants, which will be all female seeds. And this presents an opportunity for a cultivator to be more efficient in the cultivation mechanisms, such as using less water, less space, less labor cost to actually get better products. And we also have auto-flowering seeds, which is not something that is very prevalent in an equatorial climate, because auto-flowering seeds will particularly breed to include and incorporate the ruderalis gene, which is not a photosensitive gene. And this allows people in a temperate climate to be able to harvest a crop before the fluctuation in day length, moving closer to the Christmas period, such as the days getting shorter. But we have interest in terms of breeding autoflower seeds that may have a longer flowering time, that may be able to triple biomass throughout production via cultivating in an equatorial space. And the new kid on the block, we have triploid seeds. And triploid seeds simply have an extra chromosome, and what that does, it renders the plant infertile. And this has an advantage, because you will be able to produce seedless flower consistently without any pollination taking place from a hermaphrodite or a male plant. And the fact that every individual household has the right to plant 4 plants, it pretty much limits based on the scope of cannabis, because 4 plants could be anything. It could be 4 seedlings, it could be 4 males, it could be 4 hermaphrodites. But we know the economic value is in the female pistillate plants. So focusing on that female plant where the value presents itself, triploid seeds are similar to breadfruit, bananas, which are all triploids. So breeding triploid cannabis, and particular that extra chromosome, we see levels of overcompensation, such as higher trichome density, trichomes with multiple heads. We also see where disease resistance have been incorporated in terms of triploid breeding. And this is where we see the sector moving to in terms of germinoplasm preservation and meeting cultivation marks for commercial distribution consistently. When we look at cultivation is something that is extremely dynamic. So when I heard that you have licenses for outdoor cultivation and indoor cultivation, that pretty much limits the opportunity that a cultivator could extend his cultivation science, because we have greenhouse, we have open field, we have indoor, and we even have mixed light cultivation. And mixed light cultivation is important to understand unlocking the true genetic potential of the plant, because what that presents is we have days that are very overcast and rainy days where the plant is not going to where the plant will not get that photosynthetic spectrum to produce secondary metabolites, which has the medicinal value. And this pretty much presents an opportunity to provide supplemental lighting, because the flowering period is genetically programmed for a particular time period. So once the photosynthetic light does not reach the plant, it pretty much limits the quality, the expression, and the yield. So incorporating hybrid mechanisms would ensure success is always continued based on cultivating cannabis. So this picture presents a field in Antigua from the Caribbean Queen cultivar, and you can see the uniformity and no supplemental lighting, simple irrigation presenting. And these are the sort of cultivation styles that we would like to present in terms of a sustainable approach to like cultivating cannabis, because we see in the first world countries where indoor or controlled atmospheric conditions, cannabis is much cheaper versus sun-grown cannabis is much more expensive. So the Caribbean region has a unique opportunity to use solar radiation to grow cannabis, and research has definitely demonstrated that sun-grown cannabis presents a more holistic approach to like healing and a wider plethora of phytochemicals compared to indoor or controlled atmospheric cultivation. And when we look at the nutrients, like nutrients is very important, and we know coming out of bananas that the ills and negatives associated with chemicals being used in the production cycle. Traveling throughout St. Lucia yesterday, I saw the persuasive use of glyphosate, which is a huge concern, and the data presents those non-communicable diseases associated with exposure to these highly hazardous chemicals. And cannabis presents an opportunity based on a nutrient program, because it's a very heavy feeder. So the use of nutrients and biostimulants is very important in terms of administering the plant to unlock that true genetic potential, to understand the phytochemical constituents of the plant. And when we look at pesticides, it is very alarming that the persuasive use of pesticides as entering our food chain is extremely alarming. So focus on more use of biorationals and biological pesticides that come from natural sources and don't necessarily target the natural enemies such as the wasp, the ladybugs, so on. So is using organisms such as bacteria and fungi to reduce the exposure in terms of chemical or insect damage to your crops. I understand farmers complain a lot about caterpillar damage, and the solution to that is the use of BT, Bacillus triangulus, which is a bacterial spore. And once the caterpillar ingests that spore, it ruptures its digestive tract, and it does not allow a residual level or persistent residue within the environment. So understanding sustainable applications for pesticide and fungicide applications is important to understanding public health and safety in administering cannabis publicly. So this is a list of descriptors that my students and I have developed. Next slide, please. And what that presents is the opportunity to go through the entire plant life cycle and collect data to understand the expression of the plant, the morphological characteristics, and to understand the commercial viability of cultivating cannabis in a tropical climate, because it's a very different game of cultivating cannabis in a temperate climate. They have one natural season they can harvest the plant naturally outdoor, but we have a unique opportunity where we could harvest plant perpetually 365 days of the year. So that is a unique opportunity, and as the world turns and cannabis becomes more liberal, we see where production is going to be pushed more towards the equatorial zones. So understanding criteria in terms of breeding mechanisms, understanding the aesthetics and organoleptic organoleptic qualities that these plants present, the data must be collected to understand what are we doing and how, what is the potential of the commercial viability of cultivating cannabis in a tropical space. And this is some data that my students develop, and we are able to plot different cultivars on graphs to go through the life cycle. And the first graph on my left hand side presents plant height, and it shows you that plants grown with the same nutrients, the same atmospheric, does have advantages based on growth rate to biomass ratios. So you may be putting all your energy in a particular cultivar, but you are not getting substantial commercial viability by actually growing that particular cultivar. So it's important to understand the expression of certain cultivars and how you could enhance that production to get that commercial value. Even at the lower side of the slide, this is an interesting study because we looked at a hybrid cultivar, we looked at an temperate cultivar, and we looked at an equatorial landrace. And although the temperate cultivar had a much larger leaf area index, the equatorial plant or the heirloom variety demonstrated significant differences in growth rate to biomass ratio from weeks 4 to 7. And this shows you that the plant is more suited and more intelligent to unlock its potential in an equatorial climate via growing. So I would put less energy, less inputs to actually get greater yields and greater results from incorporating these equatorial genes into certain cultivars. So it's important to know what to grow, how to grow it, and when should you grow these plants, because we have a fluctuating photo period where the May-June solstice we have longer days, such as 13.7 hours of light, versus the Christmas period, we get down to 11.8 hours of light per day. So these allow other plants to bring about different expressions and quality assurance mechanisms just by understanding the difference in photo periods. Even when we look at the yield, we look at the flowering time, and the flowering time is something that's very critical because this is genetically programmed within these plants. And we look at the THC, the CBD ratios, and I will talk about that soon. But looking at the total yield of the entire plant, looking at the economic value of the actual buds, which is what presents that commercial value. So what this shows is that you may also get a plant which is entire biomass, may be more productive, but the actual economic value in the buds is significantly reduced. So we look at characteristics such as what is the bud to trim ratio, and if you have a higher trim to bud ratio, that means you will be putting in a lot more work to get much less yields. So these things are serious prospects in terms of commercializing a regulated space, in terms of understanding, unlocking the economic potential of cultivating cannabis. And this is another study that we did in 5 ganja growing communities that were mapped in 1987 by the CIA. And what we went in to understand was the socio-economic demographics and the potential of these traditional cultivators in terms of their viability within the economy surrounding cannabis. And it shows you that cannabis has been something based on generational wealth, where the indigenous knowledge has been passed on through generations. And it also shows that the interconnectiveness based on productivity mechanisms such as the plants, the yield, and understanding cultivation styles to suit unique environmental conditions such as wetland systems to dry forest habitats to humid to humid mountain tops, and the ingenious knowledge that these traditional farmers have is something that we see that commercialization has been able to ignore the artisanal production of these cultivators to be able to unlock that genetic potential consistently via cultivating cannabis. And this particular graph on my left hand side shows you that the expression of the plant varies based on the microclimate that these plants are actually grown in, and how these cultivators have been able to manipulate certain techniques to actually produce plants that could be viable and sustainable in terms of its economic value. So when we focus on harvesting, that's a very important criteria, because you could grow the best cannabis in the world, but if you don't harvest and manage the plant properly, it becomes a poor quality cannabis. And everything we grow cannabis for is in these glands. These glands are known to be the trichome glands. They are oil-based, and they synthesize the secondary metabolites that present the therapeutic value, such as the cannabinoids, the steroids, the flavonoids, the terpenoids, and this shows that the interaction of all these phytochemicals presents an opportunity for therapeutic and medicinal value. So understanding the way that these plants biosynthesize and store trichomes is important to understand the integrity of the final product in understanding its administration as a therapeutic product. So post-harvest is extremely important, and what we see is the aim of post-harvest is to ensure maximum preservation of these trichome glands, and this is done by the maintenance of three particular criteria, which is temperature, humidity, and light. As we know, light breaks down chlorophyll and makes cannabis look very brown, as the majority of cannabis I have seen here is not necessarily well post-harvested and meets the integrity of the consumer. And what that shows too is that once cannabis is poorly stored or poorly harvested and managed, we see where the psychoactive component of the plant, such as the THC and the non-psychoactive component, could actually go through isomeric forms and present cannabinoids that the plant does not produce. And one of the well-known cannabinoids is CBN, and CBN is an isomeric form of THC. And when we see CBN spiking higher than 1%, this definitely shows us that the cannabis is possibly old, or it's been through various unsavvy conditions via the post-harvest practices. And CBN gives a very lethargic, narcotic, lazy type of euphoria, which is generally felt in the frontal cortex of your brain, where it has a lot of receptors. And then we also see that the temperatures that we get daily, the larger trichomes, such as 90 to 120 microns, simply just melt off the plant via exposed temperatures. And one of the greatest challenges that we have, that we see in terms of traditional post-harvest practices, is the fact that the plant dries up throughout the day, but in the night the humidity allows the plant to absorb water. And if this happens every single day, it really compromises the integrity and preservation of these trichome glands, and you are really depleting the quality of your product as you move along to consumption. So when we focus on cannabis quality assurance, it's important to understand the ensuring of public health and safety in administering cannabis and its derivatives to the actual public, and the maintenance of environmental stewardship in adhering to sustainable practices. So quality assurance protocols tend to attempt to address concerns such as microbial contamination, heavy metal content, pesticide residue, and the quantification of the important phytochemicals and terpenes that actually provide that holistic approach to its therapeutic value. So all these relevant parameters are very important in terms of ensuring consistency and validity within the cannabis supply chain. So when we look at potency, we see that, so just to say a story, that when Jamaica decriminalized in 2015, we did an island-wide survey, and the average potency was at 8% THC. There was an outlier that tested at 13% THC. But in today's market, we see cannabis potency exceeding thresholds of 30% THC. And what happens is that the cannabis generally, particularly our original heirloom varieties, presented a ratio of non-psychoactive to psychoactive components of 8:1, 10:1. But in the modern day cannabis, where the non-psychoactive component has been bred down significantly to less than 0.3%, it actually presents a wider disparity in the psychoactive component, that when one inhales cannabis, it's only the psychoactive component that is binding to your receptors. And we have seen that high THC consumption presents challenges such as schizophrenia, anxiety, and other various conditions associated with the prolonged use of high THC consumption. Particularly 20 and 15 years ago, an adolescent wanting to experience cannabis for the first time would generally get something of much lower potency. But today, those high potency cultivars of 30% and 28 could actually present challenges to the developing brain. But there is an interesting paper that was recently published coming out of England that shows prolonged use of cannabis has definitely demonstrated increased cognitive capabilities within the aging population of persons over 60. And we see where that is important, because in the first world, we see where the dementia-related conditions such as Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and so on, cannabis presents a serious therapeutic benefits to alleviating many of these symptoms associated. And as the CMO mentioned, that there is an endocannabinoid system, and all higher organisms such as amphibians, reptiles, mammals possess an endocannabinoid system, and that system is there to maintain homeostasis, maintaining a balance in your involuntary mechanisms such as pleasure, pain, appetite, so on. And what that shows is that in today's world, where people are not necessarily eating well, not sleeping well, cannabis could definitely contribute to increasing your human well-being in a significant way. And we always say you can't go to a shop and buy happiness, but you could buy cannabis that could increase your mood and allow that happiness to feel. So it's important. Yeah, sure. All right. I'm going to wrap up soon, right? So we also see where, in terms of THC, is something that is being inflated in the market space, and that is very challenging because they understand THC as a sort of quality parameter, which is very limiting, because cannabis provides a plethora of phyto constituents that are very important to understanding the healing effect of cannabis. So regulating and testing is very important to mitigate those things. This particular graph is a graph that shows heavy metal constituents in cannabis, and the concern comes from arsenic, lead, cadmium, and mercury. And those things can definitely have challenges in terms of quality assurance. Pesticide residue is one that's very critical, because the heavy metals associated in terms of pesticide can include neurotoxins, which can be very poisonous and cause and linked to chronic brain disorders. So the limitations, the quantification of these active ingredients are very important to mitigate, particularly the methods of consumption where these compounds may be heated up to very high temperatures that can pose challenges based on its neurology. And these are two particular pests that I didn't manage to see cannabis plants here, but we have seen where countries that have legalized, we see where the cannabis aphid, which actually carries out this entire life cycle on the cannabis plant, has entered Caribbean jurisdictions in recent times. We also see where the hemp russet mite, which actually comes from India and poses serious cultivation challenges. So to mitigate the entry of some of those insects in your legal and regulated space is important to understand the sustainability of cultivating cannabis locally. Microbial contamination, very, very, very critical, and we did some work looking at microbial contamination in the regulated and unregulated space, and we isolated 145 moles and 166 bacterial species. And when we look at the unregulated space, had a wider variety of microorganisms contamination, but it's important to note that the regulated space, because of controlled atmospheric post-harvest practices, we see where Aspergillus species that does have implications on health was more present in the regulated space than the unregulated space. This shows you different criteria in terms of understanding total mole and yeast content in terms of cannabis plants, while some may pass, such as the tea and herbal infusions. We see where more specific coliforming units in terms of cannabis management, such as states like Connecticut and Iowa, it was much harder for these samples to pass these thresholds for coliforming units. So quality assurance, we need to understand the development of standards and regulations for the cannabis value chain. We need to understand that the cannabis consumer, from a medical, adult use, and sacramental perspective, require consistency, quality, and replicability. Cultivators need to differentiate between quality parameters and levels of contaminants. The post-harvest and storage conditions need to be optimized and standardized. The areas that dispense cannabis publicly and the medical practitioners need to be aware of the needs of the consumers. And the key market drivers that we see cannabis in terms of economic prospects is to integrate within the global expansion in terms of medicinal cannabis, to understand quality assurance and patient-driven access within the local population, to understand wellness and tourism ventures such as cannabis-friendly resorts, experiences, farm tours, culinary events, and the export opportunity presents itself to understand the production of sun-grown, high-quality cannabis that would be able to enter international markets and have a very secure space. So the opportunities such as medicinal wellness, local cultivation and craft production, value-added products, and to administer research and biotechnology advances is very important for unlocking that economic potential. So in conclusion, there must be an integrated approach to developing a domestic cannabis economy within the Caribbean region, from policy to legal framework to historical and cultural experiences. Business, marketing, science, medicinal points of view are all necessary and all must be considered. And we see where this has not necessarily taken root, but the academic institutions, the public and private sector all need to coordinate to facilitate necessary research and funding, which is needed to provide a greater understanding of the backward, forward, and cross linkages of the cannabis supply and value chain. Give thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Emmanuel. One can appreciate the intense research that has been put into the cannabis plant, the root, and all the parts of the herb. We will now move to our final presentation before we move on to the panel discussion. Gentle reminder, you can get some eats from the Green Zen over here to my left, your right. Please feel free to patronize. And now we examine what modern science has accepted by introducing Dr. Gerald Thompson, an infectious disease specialist and currently serves as Chief Executive Officer of the Medicinal Cannabis Regulatory Authority of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, where he has led the development of a comprehensive regulatory framework, including legal banking, seed-to-sale tracking, patient access systems, export mechanisms, and the Cannabis Festival. A former Minister of Telecommunications, Science, Technology, and Industry, and elected Member of Parliament, he also previously served as the Director of Special Projects and Advisor to the Prime Minister. Dr. Thompson trained in internal medicine and infectious diseases at the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey and holds a master's in public health, health policy management, and public administration from Columbia University. His research has focused on HIV in the elderly and HIV-2. He is also the host of a weekly radio program, Your Health Matters, and chairman of the Mangrove Conservation Foundation, promoting biodiversity and medicinal plant conservationists in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Put your hands together to welcome Dr. Gerald Thompson. Also, a quick note, if you'd like to use the bathrooms, they are over here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good evening. Those tacos, lovely. I had a couple of them. I recommend the persons go and try. I see persons are lined up. Let me say it's wonderful being back in St. Lucia. There seems to be a kind of vibe here in St. Lucia. I love it. Although it seems a little chilly tonight. Is it always like this? Huh? You understand? Yeah. Now, let me go on because I'm going to go quite quickly so that we could get into the panel discussion. So I'm going to skip through a couple of the slides and so forth. So let's go to the first slide. How do I do it? Yes. Now, we in St. Vincent view that there are 10 areas that have to be addressed. And we've gone through these, the legal and regulatory framework, legal banking and taxes. And then cultivation, that Dr. Emmanuel just dealt with. And then traditional cultivators and their inclusion has been one of the principal things we have been setting as our focus. Then manufacture and quality assurance. How do you really ensure that you have world standard products? And what I'm going to be talking about, number 6, patient medical benefits and the science behind it. And then what I think the CMO touched on, youth and harm prevention. And then, of course, big areas, export, trade, tourism. And then the global trends, the whole subject of what we call rescheduling that's happening in the United States, and then alternative development and so forth was a big subject. Now, let me have next slide. How do I move things along? Yes. Now, in 2016, the United Nations did something really important. In the past, there had only been a focus on what we call supply reduction, interdiction, and also demand reduction, trying to get people to use drugs less. But then they came up with the concept of human rights. The human rights of people who are indigenous, human rights of Rastafari, human rights in general. And they also pointed out that in many parts of the world, medicines were just not available. Medicines that are produced by the big pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer and so forth, were just not available, too expensive. And they started to recognize that there are other alternative remedies that those countries, those remote parts of the world could use and should use. And they also introduced the subject of alternative development. This really changed the whole look at drugs. Now, many persons don't really recognize some of these things, but you should recognize that drugs have been governed by international treaties, several international treaties, and cannabis was on every single one of those three treaties, the 1961, 1971, 1988, and essentially there was a schedule in which a drug could be classified as Schedule 1. Schedule 1, that's the most stringent of the regulations you would have for a narcotic drug, a psychoactive drug, or so. And there was Schedule 2 and Schedule 3, Schedule 3 being the least restrictive, but still some aspect of regulation. But there was also what's called a Schedule 4, in which this was a list of drugs dubbed not to have any medical value whatsoever. Imagine cocaine, imagine fentanyl, several other things were not in this Schedule 4, but cannabis was not only in Schedule 1, the most stringent of the regulations, but also in Schedule 4, not having any medical value whatsoever. And in 2020, December 2020, on the recommendation of the World Health Organization, the United Nations, CND, what we call the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, finally removed cannabis from Schedule 4. Imagine just 6 years ago, it was finally recognized that cannabis actually had some medical value. Now, people throughout the world, in India, Rastafari would have recognized that it had medical value long before this, and it was pointed out this has been going on for thousands of years. Next slide, please. Now, what I want you to understand is that this is a list of some pain medications. And would you believe aspirin was only discovered in the late 1800s. Ibuprofen, Advil as we know it, only came onto the market 50 years ago. Only 50 years ago. Now opium, over the top right, has been around for a long time. It has been a medication from which we've derived heroin, we've derived morphine, we've derived all these. It's been the parent of a lot of these narcotic drugs. And the point that's being made here is that pain medication has been required for centuries. Whether someone stumped their toe, or whether somebody got shot by an arrow, or stabbed by a sword, they have required pain medications. And in the past, if these medications were not available, then people would have had to use other type of plant-based medicines in terms of helping to relieve some of their pain. But I want to point out that if you see on the left, 4 down, fentanyl. Last year, fentanyl killed over 106,000 people in the United States from drug overdoses. I used to prescribe fentanyl in the United States, just below Duragesic patches. My AIDS patients, I used to give them patches because many of them were neurological pain. They had all sorts of different pain. And I was told that these medications were some of the best. They were great. I had no perception that they were so addictive that they would actually drive people in relation to drug overdose and so forth. Down at the bottom there is something called fentanyl, which is 50 to 100 times more powerful, more potent than fentanyl itself. And that's on the street in the market. I was on a conference call just a week ago, and Trinidad was talking about ketamine, which is a tranquilizer for animals, is now one of the biggest illegal drugs there, and it's going to filter up through our chain to St. Vincent, to St. Lucia, and upwards. 2 years ago, I was in Jamaica. Jamaica was talking about ketamine being a problem. And so the abuse of drugs has been really on the increase. At the bottom of this list here in blue, you will see Xanax and Valium. As a doctor, man, I prescribe that like crazy. And today, I tell you, in the Caribbean, our doctors prescribe that like it's water. And it is now the biggest cause of overdose in Europe, in Scotland. Let me have the next slide. And you can see there that in terms of street benzos, Valium and so forth, Scotland has been at the top of the list in terms of drug overdose. But there hasn't been the emphasis on these drugs. And I'm really glad that we don't see high uses of fentanyl. And so, although it's creeping into the area, but we're seeing high uses of Valium, and so among especially our elderly population, especially women. Next slide, please. Now, I want to tell you about my experience. I'm an infectious disease specialist. I consider myself as an immunologist. And when I went to medical school, I was taught that there are 11 systems in the body. 11 systems in the body. We know all of them: the neurological system, the respiratory system, the reproductive system, and so on. And it was only until 1995, where I was attending a lecture in NYU in New York, that I heard for the first time a new system had been discovered: the endocannabinoid system. Prior to that, in medical school, I'd never been taught about that. It hadn't been discovered yet. And for probably the next 10, 15 years, persons who attended medical school, wherever, were not taught about this. So we have a disparity. The majority of doctors, especially older doctors, have never really heard about the endocannabinoid system. Today, over the last 3-4 years, you're seeing in some medical schools, in some training sessions, this being talked about, but it's not being. What is the endocannabinoid system all about? Well, I'll tell you, it's present in dogs, it's present in cats, it's present in fish, and it's certainly present in the human beings. Every single one of you has an endocannabinoid system inside of you. And you may be hearing that for the first time. And what it consists of is that there are certain substances that are produced in your body that interact with receptors that are located in various other parts of your body. And then these substances, we have enzymes that break them down. And this constitutes our endocannabinoid system. Whenever you have any of these substances, what we call anandamide and 2-AG, not being produced in the right way, or if there's any excess production of these substances, it distorts the endocannabinoid system. At the same time, if there are factors that cause rapid breakdown or delayed breakdown of these substances, it also disrupts the system. And so we have a situation where some of us, in the same way that you could have, as in diabetes, insulin deficiency, you could have a situation where your endocannabinoid system is deficient. And we found that this can lead to something called FIM. Let me go to the next slide, please. It can lead to something called FIM, where there's what we call fibromyalgia, pain. There is inflammatory bowel disorders, and there's a certain type of predilection for migraine headaches. Now here, Dr. Emmanuel would have put up some remarkable slides. I'm showing you this bud in cannabis, and he would have also shown you how on the flower bud of the cannabis that there are these little tentacles or trichomes filled with fluid. And that fluid inside there is a certain something I'm going to talk a little bit more about. But we have the symbol for cannabis as being the cannabis leaf. But really and truly, it's the flower bud that has in a lot of the active substances. Now, I put this slide up really to show you that the leaves still has a small amount. And the roots of the plant also has a very small amount. And many of your grandmothers might well have gotten into boiling the root in order to treat certain other substances. And this was long before ibuprofen would have been discovered. This would have been long before certain other medications, modern medicines that we know would have come onto the market. But the boiling of the cannabis root has been a well-known form of treatment, especially for asthma. Now, let me next slide, please. Now, I want to make the point that everyone here knows if you eat turmeric and ginger, it's good for you. We know spinach and so forth is good for you. We know eating broccoli and all those other things. We're told, eat those things. Our CMO would love if everybody is eating the right amount of food rather than all these processed foods with high sugar contents. And we'll be really making a big dent in diabetes and hypertension if we were to do something like this. So we know that plant-based foods are good for us. Matter of fact, I just had a taco there, and the folks there, I mean, it's all vegetable-based. I don't think there was any meat inside there at all. But what I want to point out is that plant-based medicine has been around for a long time. And we've discovered this in penicillin was discovered in 1930. And what did it produce? Well, it was penicillin, it produced an antibiotic. And what they were able to do after that is to use the chemical makeup of what they found and produce synthetic penicillin. In the thing below is something called periwinkle. Did everybody, periwinkle should be very common here in St. Lucia. Periwinkle, someone had suspected periwinkle was good for diabetes. So one of the drug companies investigated and said, it's not so great for diabetes. It has a little benefit, but they found a substance in periwinkle called vincristine and vinblastine. And prior to the 1950s, almost 90% of kids who developed childhood leukemia, something called acute lymphocytic leukemia, would die. The advent of vincristine, 90% of them survived just from this plant. But to do it, they didn't necessarily, they got the image of the substance from the plant, the vincristine, and they were able to synthetically produce it. And similarly, in terms of the Pacific U, there's a plant that we were able to get something called Taxol. And this Taxol is now one of the primary means of treating breast cancer and has remarkably had a big impact on the survival rate of persons with breast cancer. So I am laying the basis that plant-based medicine has been developed. Normally, it is a big company taking that particular plant and the substance they've discovered and now synthetically producing it in the way they want it, so to get the consistency of that product. Next slide. Now, in the case of cannabis, it would be great if you could just simply extract CBD, and that's done, and extract THC, and that's done. But they've found that CBD on its own certainly has profound benefits. But if CBD also has some of the other cannabinoids with it, a small amount of THC, CBG, CBN, a bit of this, a bit of that, that it is much more effective. And this is something called the entourage effect. And so, with those other drugs I pointed out to you, the isolation of those drugs and synthetically producing them has been very effective. But for cannabis, they've found, and they've certainly had some big benefits from CBD alone, but CBD alone is going to be great for certain conditions, but it's not going to do everything. With some conditions, you need more THC. With some, you will need a balanced amount or small amount. But in general, having some of these other cannabinoids along to give you that entourage effect is important. And that breaks the mold of having a purely synthetically produced type substance. Next slide. Now, I pointed out that in terms of the endocannabinoid system, if you can have a deficiency in that system, and right down on my far right, I mentioned the word FIM, fibromyalgia, inflammatory bowel disorders, and migraine. Those are the core things when you have endocannabinoid deficiency of this endocannabinoid system. And then for replacement, you could use cannabis as what we call those things I showed you in the previous slide. We call the phytocannabinoids, which come from plants. The CBD, the THC, the CBG, CBN, all those sort of things. And that you can replace those things that were there in that state of deficiency, and to some extent you can restore some of the problems that would have existed. Or you can go synthetically. And the synthetic products, we have them there, Epidiolex. We have a number of other products, synthetic CBD, synthetic THC. They're great, wonderful. Remember what I said, they don't have that complete effect. But the other thing too is that those medication, 1 month's supply is often $1,000 a month. And that means that the head of the Rastafari faith, if you weren't able to use your cannabis, you'd have to buy Epidiolex for $1,000 a month. Or maybe the pharmaceutical services of St. Lucia would have to import that through the PPS, and make sure that is in great supply. And so you have to make a decision. Do you say we want things that are synthetically produced and so forth, things like that, that's going to cost, and give the big pharmaceutical companies a nice big fat check, you know? Or are there other means of looking at this? Next slide, please. Now, in St. Vincent de Grenadines, throughout the world, you've heard that there are a number of conditions that are certified that cannabis can be used for. These conditions can be categorized. We've come up with a mnemonic that's easy to remember. It's called AMP Minds. When we do the training of our doctors and pharmacists, we've trained over 150 doctors and pharmacists in St. Vincent. I've been honored to have been invited to Barbados to train almost 50 doctors there on the proper medical use of cannabis. And in St. Vincent, we have put a handbook together of the proper use. And this copy, it's copywritten, but we gave it to Barbados and said you could change it. And I want to say tonight, I would certainly like to hand the original electronic version so that you could customize that for your own use and make the necessary adjustments based on your policies so that you are right. But there's some fundamental things here. AMP Minds. A stands for appetite. As an infectious disease specialist, in the 90s, I was losing my patients. Losing them because I saw them getting thin. I had an opportunity to travel to Kenya, where they called AIDS Slim's disease. Slim's disease, because people were just getting thinner and thinner and thinner because they just would, and losing weight, losing body mass and so forth meant you weren't getting the nutrients you needed to help fight off the HIV infection. So people died a lot quicker than usual. The bottom line is that in HIV, in my patients, I don't want to get into it, the story will take too long, but I was caused to write a recommendation for cannabis to be used by a lawyer who was under my care, who'd convinced me, and I checked out my lawyer and so forth, said that I could write this prescription. At the time I was hell scared of writing a prescription. But after writing the prescription, about 2 months later, I got a letter on my desk. You as a doctor must not write any cannabis prescription. You'll be prosecuted and so forth. This is in the United States, New York. And at the time, I thought that somebody put up some cameras in my office and so, but what it was that very last treaty on trafficking in 1988, 1990 that prohibited the trafficking, and so I would have been accused of trafficking if I were to prescribe. The long and short of this is that for patients who are HIV, who are losing weight, and there are other means of doing it, using cannabis helped them significantly. I saw patients put on weight. Prior to that, I was set dead against cannabis because that's what I thought. I didn't know anything about it. I was never taught about this. And that was what sparked my own interest. And certainly in cancer patients, we see benefit. We do not see so much benefit in young ladies who for some neuropsychological reasons don't want to eat because of the anorexia nervosa. We don't see the benefit there, but certainly cancer patients, they benefit. And then metabolic disorders, M, nausea, vomit. You've heard about that before. There's also and elements in diabetes, and so mild, early diabetes, not severe end-stage diabetes. And then P, pain. And that I want you to say pain is so common, especially chronic pain. It may not be the best for acute pain. You sprain an ankle, or you stump your toe, but chronic pain, chronic back pain, all these sort of things, it's really beneficial in that regard. And then M, mood disorders, and by that I'm talking about depression. 4.5% of the global population suffer from depression. 5% of people suffer from anxiety, especially females, and I hate to say this, you know. And then there's the PTSD, and all these benefit significantly from cannabis, but not so much THC. They benefit more from CBD. And then you have inflammation, you know, inflammation, the arthritis, all these sort of things. And when you see arthritis there, we see in St. Vincent an age group over the age of 60 of ladies going into the store. They're not looking to smoke, but they want to pick up their creams and rub their elbows and their knees with. Anybody who's suffering from arthritis, there may be some benefits. Yes, you should take your ibuprofen or other things. The ibuprofen may upset your stomach, it may cause all kind of problem. But it's interesting how the elderly population has gravitated to this for arthritic condition, and this condition of the arthritides, a host of them, not just rheumatoid arthritis or osteoarthritis, but a whole set of arthritides in which there can be benefits. Now, in terms of neurological conditions, they range not just from the epilepsies and so forth, from nerve phantom, nerve damage, and then some conditions where there's probably the least level of evidence, where some patients benefit, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, and so forth. There may be some other method, but some patients actually really benefit in many regards. And we know multiple sclerosis, the spasms, and so forth, muscle spasms that they go through, significant benefit. But a condition I want to really address is sleep disorders. 20% of the global population suffer from sleep disorders. Earlier on, I counted about 100 persons here. 20 of you suffer from sleep disorder, you know? 20, and it ain't just doctors. CMO, we have to stay up at night on call and so forth. We suffer from sleep disorders. But a lot of people suffer from sleep disorders. And higher THC levels, rather than the CBD, benefits from that. What I'm pointing out to you is that there are certain conditions, such as appetite and metabolic disorders, that would benefit more from THC type products, and sleep disorders that definitely benefit from THC products. But the ones in the middle, mood disorders, anxiety, depression, and so forth, benefit more from CBD. But pain can benefit from either of those things. Next slide, please. Now, what I want to point here is that this gives you an idea of how dosing is done. And if I'm having pain and I want quick relief of pain, it's the fastest way of getting rid of the pain is to inhale it. And I want to urge St. Lucia not to restrict the inhalation of cannabis, whether you restrict it just to vaping or you don't restrict smoking. You are going to see then masses of illegal importation of cannabis for those. So that the quickest onset of cannabis is going to be from smoking. Vaping, roughly the same. Dropping under your tongue, you see the onset of relief in about 15 minutes. But smoking is 2-3 minutes. If you take a tablet, and in St. Vincent we manufacture and we produce tablets, but it take an hour to start working. And you have to look at that very carefully. Next slide. This is some of our products that are made in St. Vincent. We have another company just about to start up their own two sets of manufacturing. And this is high quality stuff, you know, that includes vapes, capsules, we have gummies and other things of that nature. Next slide, please. This is a manufacturing plant. One company on the left, and this is a manufacturing plant. These plants have to come GMP ready. And let me go to the next slide. I want to just touch on these last two slides. This is the human brain. And fentanyl, cocaine, all the general narcotics. If you take an overdose, there are opioid receptors all over your brain. These things will knock you out. You'll go to sleep. But there's a part of the brain, the back of the brain, called the cerebellum. The medulla oblongata, that controls your respiration, your heart rate, and your vomiting reflex. An overdose of these narcotic drugs suppresses that area. So when somebody is knocked out, they essentially almost stop breathing. Their heart rate goes down to 0 or near 0, and they die. Or they may have a vomiting reflex, and the vomit goes into their lungs. Surprisingly, the way the God has made us, for cannabis, there doesn't seem to be this high concentration of receptors. I mean, cannabis receptors all over the brain, but instead, in terms of the medulla, there doesn't seem to be any. So you take an overdose, or somebody take excessive amount of cannabis, it may put you to sleep and knock you out, but your respiration and your heart rate is going to be maintained. So to date, we have not seen an overdose death from cannabis. And I think the CMO is right. What we've seen is somebody driving under the influence, like with alcohol or with fentanyl or Valium or cannabis. You don't want that. You know? We typically don't restrict people driving on the influence of narcotics, Percocet and this and the other. We typically don't do that. But for cannabis, you know, we do that just like with alcohol. And you still have to do that. But the important thing is that persons are not going to die from an overdose, as we see and as we've been seeing in the United States, as we've been seeing in Scotland. Next slide, please. The United States has just rescheduled. I've been talking about this for a number of years now. The rescheduling, they are moving cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. That's going to mean that tourists are going to feel they could take cannabis on the cruise ship and bring it down with them. They could take it on the plane. And as a result, cannabis, you know, is legal in 40 states recreationally. And we're going to see a major onslaught. I am glad that there are 8 islands in the Caribbean that have legalized for medicinal cannabis. There's not necessarily a need for harmonization because everyone has to do, but there has to be collaboration. We have a Caribbean Cannabis Forum, and I really want to applaud St. Lucia to be the initiator of that particular process. And we have been really speaking and talking to each other with respect to how we could collaborate. Because we can have what's called an intersay. And within the region, not that we're going to look at protectionism, but I shouldn't say this. Well, I was going to say something, but it might get me in trouble. But the important thing is that visitors are going to come here, and if they have medical conditions and they've been in the habit of using smokable cannabis, they're going to want that. They're not going to want some droppers under their tongue or some capsule. And it's good to have that available too. In our jurisdiction, the figure of 25 years of age for the youth, I consider that as quite high. You know, when I speak, when we have forum with the youth, and we can't tell the youth, a youth who's 24, 23 or 24, who's just finished a law degree or finished their medical degree, that your brain still isn't developed. You know, they wouldn't really accept that. So in terms of the whole communication and so forth aspect, one of our weak points, we do have to intensify our efforts with the youth. And rescheduling coming from the United States is a big, massive threat to the Caribbean as an industry. And you're going to be seeing the movement of cannabis, not just from Canada, but from the United States down to the Caribbean, because it's their backyard. The last slide, please. Let me just say the last slide. Everyone should know in St. Vincent, we do have a festival called Cannabis. Minister, I would love to formally invite you to Cannabis of 2026 later this year, but invite everybody. It's an educational program, but it's also a celebration of the culture and all that sort of stuff in terms of the whole creation of this industry. And so with that, I think that's my last slide. I want to thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to some questions.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Thompson, for that insightful conversation. At this point, we will move to the panel discussion. So may I invite the panelists to start making their way to the stage. So I invite Kurt Harris, who will be the moderator for this event, back on stage. Dr. Marshall Emmanuel. In order, we would have the Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Sharon Belmar George, then followed by... Kurt, you are not Dr. Sharon Belmar George. No, I'm not. Then we have Dr. Marshall Emmanuel. Can I get a round of applause for our panelists, please? Followed by Dr. Gerald Thompson, then the Honorable Priest Kailash, accompanied by Mr. Dylan Norbert Inglis. Mr. Harris will be moderating the session. We will be getting your mics shortly.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for staying with us. We know it has been a long night, so we just have one question to ask each of the panelists, and then we'll take questions quickly from the audience. So we'll start with you, Dr. Belmar. And given all of the scientific developments that have taken place as it relates to cannabis, how do you see cannabis being integrated into the public health system, knowing all what has occurred with cannabis, all of the advantages that cannabis has for different ailments, and how it can benefit the populace?
Good evening, Mr. Harris. Good evening, everyone. I think with the method that was already taken by the Regulated Substance Authority, by the close collaboration with the Ministry of Health in the rollout of the legislation, has already been a first step in ensuring that the concerns and the cautions from the health authorities are taken into account. As a Ministry of Health, We use evidence-based data. We've done a lot of reviews on the use for cannabis for the health reasons, and for anything else, any medication or medicinal value that exists, we would support integrating it. However, we would want to ensure that we safeguard the health and safety, especially for the vulnerable groups, such as our under 25 years, our pregnant women, and persons who have coexisting health conditions. So the implementation of cannabis for the health benefits is extremely important to us within the health sector. And some of the measures that we would like to see is to ensure that it's properly regulated, that there is a very strong educational campaign to ensure persons get the correct information. In terms of the rollout, we would want to ensure that, for example, the smoke regulations, the public health regulations for smoking prohibition in public spaces of 2020, that these regulations are adhered to as well. And we would want to ensure that some of our sensitive areas are respected when it comes to the cultivation, the advertising, the sale, for example, religious institutions, our schools, our sports centers. We would also want to ensure that there's not advertising, unnecessary advertising, because the influence on the young minds as well. So for us, we want for whatever health benefits that the population to have access, but we want to ensure that we safeguard the health and safety of the population at the same time. We have to ensure that that balance is there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Belma. The one thing I can definitely tell you is that within the current cannabis legislation, it does take into account things like excessive advertising. It definitely does support the no smoking in public, as is already a law here in St. Lucia. I want to say that it's not a cannabis-related issue. It's just a smoking-related issue. And I think all of us here are definitely in support of no smoking in public. So it's not a cannabis-related issue as it relates to smoking. There are safeguards for pregnant persons. There are safeguards for persons under the age of 21. And one of the things that the RSA is definitely working on is to work together with the Medical and Dental Council to ensure that the prescription of cannabis is done through doctors, and they would apply their medical knowledge and know-how to determine when, where, and how, and to whom they prescribe cannabis. So I can guarantee you that based on the legislation that we have in place, that a lot of those things are taken into account. So I will pivot right now to Dr. Thompson. Dr. Thompson, you spoke a lot about the endocannabinoid system. And one of the things that we've noticed is that a lot of our physicians are not really aware of this particular system and how it interacts with cannabis. How do you see the education, and have you interacted with medical associations around the region to try to help train and develop our physicians within the region to understand cannabis and its benefits and how to apply cannabis so as to allay some of the fears, for example, that Dr. Belma raised?
Yes, absolutely. Am I being heard? Yes. I've been honored, as I said, to be invited to Barbados to participate in their training program. And I think they were quite happy with the approach taken and so forth, because they admitted in medical school there was not a single word on the endocannabinoid system. It might have been for the older physicians before the endocannabinoid system was discovered, but even since that time there hasn't been a program. The stigma that's come up, has probably also prevented that. I want to say that I would certainly love to collaborate with the RSA and on the guidance of the CMO, that the medicinal cannabis of St. Vincent and the Grenadines would definitely be available to help in this regard. But I think that we also have to, through Mona and other medical schools and so in the region ensure that persons do have some element of basic training in this area, because the endocannabinoid system is not a fiction. It's not something we've made up. It's something that the Lord Almighty has put into us and other animals, and I think we have to be able to recognize, why did he do that? You know, what is its function? It must have a role, and it's now to ensure that there's effective use of that role. And I want to say, things will start off where you're quite restricted. But in St. Vincent, we make sure that this is not something that's penalized. If somebody is found smoking in public, we essentially caution them and so forth, but we're not going to arrest them and put them in jail. There is a certain amount of right for personal possession. But I think you have to really, you know, continue doing it. Nobody smokes near school, nobody smokes near church, nobody put a playing field, and I think this is something that really has to go through the society. So the other people, from a society point, we try and prevent this. But as a long and short of it, the days when young men used to get a criminal record for possession, we have now eliminated that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So, Prince Kailash, one of the biggest challenges that we have with the cannabis industry becoming legalized is the fact that it has been so badly stigmatized. It has been habitually associated with crime. In a lot of our older folks, the fact that it's associated with Rastafari, and Rastafari is seen as something bad, and persons associate that cannabis, Rasta, crime, bad. How do you see, what do you believe is the best way for us to be able to remove that stigma and to get persons to understand that the cannabis plant is more than smoking and is not the cause of crime and a lot of the negative stigma that you find attached to cannabis?
Yes, give thanks again. Even in the beginning, I mean, my challenge was that I didn't have the slides. So the Rastafari journey is always a challenge, you know, and knowing specifically what we as a people are not only, I think that one of the mistakes that we do is that we just associate the stigmatization and the imprisonment with Rastafari. You know, Dr. Marshall Emmanuel told me of a study whereby they found out that the great majority of young people in prison for cannabis was not people with locks. You know, so you also have a lot of young people who are not Rastafari, who are being imprisoned, who are being persecuted, who have also been deprived. So when you're talking about making the historic rights and ensuring that moving forward that we have that capacity to engage in the industry in a meaningful way, it's a very sensitive thing, because I mean, there are, like in Dominica, you know, you have the Dread Act, you know, whereby people would be, Rastafari people would be shot up on sight, where families who actually killed in Dominica, right? So in St. Lucia, you know, the Mount Jimmy raid was also bad, the Coral Garden massacre in Jamaica. So in these countries, what you have seen that specifically in Jamaica, you know, that the government just gave, I think they gave them some land in St. Anne's, you know, and you have the Coral Garden Benevolent Society. In St. Lucia, even before you get into cannabis, just the fact that you mentioned human rights and the United Nations efforts to actually ensure that indigenous communities are protected, you could see that in St. Lucia, even before you address cannabis, the Rastafari community, there have not been that redress in general when it comes to education, you know, healthcare, when it comes to employment. You know, many people were just deprived of work, not just because of cannabis, but just because of appearance. You cannot go to the doctor, but if you go there, you might be afraid. So I think that it is critical that we take this thing in a wholesome manner, ensure that the sacramental use and that right that people have, because even immediately as we speak, the first time I ever bailed somebody was, I think it was last year, December last year. You know, a Rastafari, I'm talking about, I bailed him because I know him as a Rastaman, like a genuine Rasta man who uses herb to actually take care of his family. And he was found with plants, and he was billed like $38,000. Right? So, and then now you're going to harvest that herb, and you're going to say, well, we just eradicated the field that valued $1 million. The street value was $1 million. So that means that you have extracted from that individual $1 million. You have extracted from the economics of the country $1 million. So then when you say, well, how are we going to make right in that economic context? Are we going to go back and say, well, all the, not just the years that they have lost, but I mean, how am I going to get $1 million now? You know, what is in place? So even in the inception, what I was telling Mr. Inglis is that the critical thing is capacity building. How is it that you're going to place Rastafari? I learned about curing of herb about 5 years ago on a visit to Mona. Right? I learned about that terpenes would be destroyed if it is at a temperature above 18 degrees Celsius. How do we bring in the affected people? Not just the Rastafari community. I'm talking about the youth. The youth who have that interest. How do you bring them, create a structure, train them, give them that capacity to be able to compete, you know, to be able to produce the quality of product that a pharmacy here in St. Lucia can buy? Or else, you know, most of the investors I've spoken to, they want to find out how they can bring herb into St. Lucia, because all the different chemicals and all the different aspects of the herbs. And one more point I want to make is that nowadays, because of our eradication of the local plants, we have the influx of what you call foreign weed. I know, Dylan, you have been to Canada, and I was again having a further conversation with Dr. Emmanuel, and then a man told me, well, priest boy, somebody gave me a container of cannabis. And that same container of cannabis is going to reach our St. Lucian market. But where did that container of cannabis come from? That's the rejected cannabis. So you have lots of rejected cannabis called the foreign weed with high levels of bacteria, high levels of pesticides, high levels of fungus that they even spray to give it a nice smell. And that's what we have on our market. And that's what's in St. Lucia. So when we talk about the problems that we are facing, and when you come eradication and arresting and stifling the herb, you are not only affecting us as Rastafari, because we are the custodians. We are the people who plant the ital herb, the biologically, you know, potent herb without chemicals. And then now we are allowing our children to be exposed to synthetic material, things that are rejected just because of these policies. So it is critical that Rastafari is brought in a structured manner. Not to say you give them something different than anybody else, but at the same time, we need training. We need capacity. You have the cooperative. Right? What's going to happen if the cooperative? Can they store the herb? Can they test it? We need to have these things in the immediacy, and things that could actually help us as a group of people to really tap into that economic market and benefit from it. And also, like, as of now, you know, I think that there should be some level of conversation and what you call political will. I mean, you know, we have minister, we have the Senate, you know, that to say, well, talk to the commissioner and say, oh, honorable commissioner, you know, how can we not, you know, arrest, you know, and have people further criminalized, you know, and have a man in a cell for 10 days, charging $48,000, and then the people with the guns. You know, the people with the guns being billed at 10,000, 12,000. You know, all these things there are still happening as we speak. So these are things that I think that out of this, in the immediacy, we could begin to take this step so that I, as a Rastafari, the youth man that's doing his little thing, and the other people within the community could feel, well, okay, what is happening is towards our benefit. But boy, herb is decriminalized, but yet still now, the Rasta man is still in jail and afraid to actually grow his herb. Give thanks.
Thank you very much for that. So, Dr. Emmanuel, perfect way for us to segue from what Prince Kayla spoke about, the science, the training, the importance. And a lot of persons don't know that you are one of the foremost cannabis scientists in the world. From what I understand, they rate you as number 3, but I believe you're really number 1. What really can we do within this region? Because what we have noticed is that the persons in the north have been dominating the cannabis industry. Canada, with very little sun and a lot of cold, seems to be the largest cannabis producer and benefactor of cannabis. Yet still, from your presentation, clearly, persons within the tropical region definitely have a benefit. So what really can we do to help with the education of persons in terms of cannabis science, as well as causing us here in this region to really create a niche and benefit as we should from a plant that really and truly resides in our region?
Yes, and thank you for that question, because it's very prudent that we as a region be able to unify and understand the region as a single trading block where like cannabis is in our concern. We see where the international investors does not look at the region in isolation in terms of separate island states, but as a regional area that has a strong history and connection with the cannabis plant, and that also provides for brand equity and branding and GIs and geographical indicators from like that sense. So it is very important that we facilitate the competence building, the research, the funding, the understanding of the forward and backward linkages from cultivation to consumption, but also the support, the auxiliary companies such as the fertilization companies, the pesticides, the services that would be needed to render and create that consistency and value of our industries locally. And it's important to also understand that whilst we facilitate medicinal cannabis, we see where we in the region have administered rights for sacramental applications, and this brings a whole new marketing prospect in the world, because right now we see where the British government is paying the Ethiopian World Federation to provide chaplaincy duties for Rastafari persons in the prisons, in the hospitals, and in the British military. And the argument now is, how do they get access to cannabis which has that moral and ethical value which was produced for sacramental purposes? We have seen differentiations in other cultural products such as kosher and halal. So we see marketing cannabis as a spiritual prospect based on the efficacy and the morality of the production mechanisms could add tremendous value globally in terms of marketing Rastafari, which we all know Bob Marley, Peter Tosh. We also see there are numerous Rastafari festivals that are held globally, and Rastafari has pretty much dominated all in various countries as far as Japan. So we also see that as a unique opportunity that could be a real marketing niche for economic prospects. In terms of the Caribbean, we see where that the Caribbean is uniquely poised as a equatorial region with rich history. So the ability to grow high quality sun-grown cannabis at a much less carbon footprint from energy consumption, from infrastructure development. We see that as a huge advantage to have that entering the global market from a niche perspective. And these things are very important to be able to understand the holistic approach towards cannabis regulation and how do we facilitate quality assurance mechanisms to ensure public health and safety and environmental stewardship is adhered to from the start. And these are the things that we need to focus on based on advancing cannabis reform policy in the region.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So now we move to the CEO. We've heard the concerns of the CMO, protecting of vulnerable groups. We've heard the concerns of the Rastafari community, the need to be included, the need to have access. We've heard the voice of Dr. Thompson, who's saying, look here, there's need for training and education of medical professionals on cannabis, on the endocannabinoid system, and we've heard from the foremost scientists in the world on cannabis, on what we can do with cannabis and how we can use cannabis, and all of the research he has done. How is the RSA going to tie all of this together to be able to deliver to St. Lucia a cannabis industry that is able to allay the flares of the CMO and the general public, deal with the issues of the Rastafarian community and other groups who have been disadvantaged over the years, utilize the talents of our very own Dr. Thompson and Dr. Emmanuel, and utilize them to grow an industry that could really benefit our citizens, both from the health benefits as well as economically.
So thank you for that. I think where we have benefited is accepting that we don't know everything. So we've taken our time to listen, and we have now reached our 4th iteration of the bill, and now have another bill by way of the amnesty bill. So where we would have started in 2021 thereabout is a very different position to where we are now, because we've listened. So we've had conversations with the Ministry of Health, we've had conversations with the Substance Abuse Secretariat, we've had conversations with the Rastafarian community, we've had conversations with our colleagues in the other jurisdictions throughout the island. So we've listened to all of these things, and as I said in my presentation, it's about a lot of the just this has to be done and just that has to be done, and worked it into the legislation, and we're still not done. We still have the opportunity up until the ayes have it in that 3rd reading to see that little piece needs to be tweaked. And we haven't given up on that exercise. We still believe that there is always more to be learned. There's always the opportunity to evolve. And even after passing the legislation, in the regulations, as they build the structure of the regime, to change and tweak things to ensure that it continues to evolve as our society evolves within the cannabis space.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that. We now take any questions that anyone in the audience may have. We'll take about 4 questions, because we know it's a bit late.
Yes. Thanks very much, Teston. Thank you very much for this great session. And as it has come to pass, I think in person here we do not have very important persons in the person of Pancho Tiqueries, Randall Bain, Dr. Marcus Day, and a group of us, Dr. King. We have been lobbying to free up the cannabis for years and years. So I'm happy tonight that, the holding hands, all the collaborations will come to pass, and something will happen pretty fast. So I'm happy to hear that our CMO is all geared and ready for integration, and that's what we need to do. We need to do what is best for our people by utilizing the herbs generally, and that great herb for the healing of the nation with our conventional medicine, putting all the checks and balances in place and do it for our people. So I'm very happy tonight, and I hope that we will get things going. In terms of those who have been affected, I think, something needs to be done in terms of reparation for the sufferation. Lots of sufferation has occurred, and even as we speak today, the police force and those that should know better are still penalizing and harassing persons who are trying to get this herb for the healing of the nation. And there's an amnesty bill that is in operation, which should have been done yesterday, last year, because as we legalize, we need the herb. So where is it? We're going to start planting it now. So this amnesty bill is super urgent, so that we have the herb to utilize as the whole legalization process comes on. So we thank you for, the session tonight, but, the glamour and the talk, and let's just do it and get it going. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Are there any other questions?
Hi, good evening, Maria Fontanel. It's not so much, well, it is kind of a question in two parts to an extent. I'm happy to hear that there are considerations when it comes to financial support for people of color, indigenous people, people from the Caribbean area, etc., as well as consideration when it comes to the development of new strains and the development of products. I know that a lot of Western countries and larger countries have taken the baton and run with it. Where that's concerned, they have developed their strains, and a lot of the guidelines, I was concerned about the guidelines, where we will be, how much of the guidelines are we adopting as opposed to creating our own, and how much support are we giving to give our people an additional push, because I think we can't be worried about a level playing field. We are like way behind right now. How do we prioritize our people to make sure that we are not cut out of the market? I know, for example, Prince Kailash has his system well established, but somebody like him who does a lot of herbal education, I'm sorry to put the spotlight on you per se, but because you're doing so much good work, I will kind of focus on you. But how are you giving scholarships, for example, to St. Lucians, to Vincentians, to Grenadians, to ensure that it's not only the people from Western context with the money who can afford to have that education, but that people from St. Lucia, from our majority Black African descended people, are prioritized to ensure that we are able to level the playing field, both in the education, in the guidelines that when it comes to development of new strains and products, and in financial support as well.
Yes, blessed love. Am I being heard?
Hello?
Rastafari.
Hello, hello.
Yes, blessed love. Give thanks. Well, I mean, the spotlight is always on the Rastafari. That's why we say we are Rasta. We shining lights. And we do have the Mon Kailash Herbal School of Esoteric Knowledge. We do offer scholarships to St. Lucian people. We also offer like a CARICOM rate, and the system that we have is that, because what has happened with cannabis is that that's just been like ganja, and you just planting ganja. Our system has never been, I deal with herbs, right? So the nutraceutical industry will hit about, $2 trillion by 2028 or so, right? So it's not just about cannabis. So what we have done, in fact, I have not made any of my riches that I have acquired by selling cannabis. I have all my riches comes from the selling of soursop leaf, guinea hen, what they call Petitfera aliciae, what they call feuille du vent, stinging nettle, St. John's bush, red raspberry. So we are not only talking about just cannabis. So when we educate people in the general about, give thanks for life. Rastafari. Right? So we do that education in general. So if someone is interested in having a scholarship from our school, we have a cohort starting in March. We always give at least 2 St. Lucian scholarship every cohort. So give thanks again. Blessed.
All right.
Yes, and I am very glad that you raised that question based off proper funding, because one thing we have not seen thus far is public-private partnerships to assist with the propelling of the supply and value chain. And we also see where other acts may need to be amended to be able to facilitate cannabis as an agricultural commodity. So the same sort of concessions that an agriculture person would be perceived to, would a cannabis farmer be able to access the same concessions, such as duty-free concessions on vehicles, on infrastructure, and so forth. So we understand that many times the cannabis may not be a gazetted crop within the agricultural extension services, but we see that as a very important opportunity to be able to build competence and to provide that support which is very much needed to allow persons to transition from the illicit market into the regulated space. And it's very important to understand the sustainability of the approach towards the human competence, which is going to serve in terms of that, capacity building for cultivating cannabis, manufacturing products, and understanding the dispensation of cannabis derivatives and raw materials to the wider population.
So, thank you very much. Thank you very much, panel, for this. We want to say a very big thank you to all of our guests who have come and supported us. To all of you online, thank you very much. And I want to say a big thank you to the panel for being with the RSA here to diving into the weeds. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have worked very hard on this, and this is a summary of the knowledge that we have put together. This is our book that we have taken the opportunity to launch tonight, called What You Should Know, Medicinal Cannabis. And anybody who's interested in this, I would ask you to visit the RSA's social media pages and website to now download a digital copy. If you did register via the link that we had given you, you will already have had a digital copy in your email as of 9 o'clock tonight, as a gesture of saying thank you for your participation and interest in the cannabis industry and the Regulated Substances Authority. I will now present each of you with one of these books. You're welcome. You're welcome. Welcome. Yes, and Dylan, you know where to get yours. All right, I will now call on Shani to give the vote of thanks.
What an evening, everyone. Yes? Yes? Yes. Thank you. Today we did more than dive into the weeds. We explored history, examined science, confronted concern, and envisioned opportunity all in one space. On behalf of the RSA, it is my honor to extend sincere and spirited thanks. We acknowledge the President of the Senate, the Honorable Alvina Reynolds, for gracing us with your presence. To our Ministers of Government, the Honorable John Paul Estefan, thank you for the affirming words, reinforcing the responsible that let's do that one again. To our Ministers of Government, the Honorable John Paul Estefan, thank you for the affirming remarks, reinforcing that responsible regulation and economic development can and must move together. And other ministers of cabinet, your presence signals that the conversation is not peripheral, it is national, it is strategic, it is now. We express deep appreciation to the Board of Directors of the RSA for your vision and stewardship, particularly our chairman, Mr. John Joseph, for setting the tone with a thoughtful and purposeful welcome address. To our valued partners, Helen's Daughters, and the St. Lucia Bureau of Standards, thank you for standing with us as we move forward rooted in empowerment, quality, and sustainability. Our invocation reminded us that policy must be grounded not only in law, but in culture, faith, and conscience. Mrs. Shamil Joseph-Pierre, General Counsel and Corporate Secretary of the RSA, and Mr. Aaron Alexander, President of the Ionola Council for the Advancement of Rastafari, we thank you. To our exceptional panelists, the Right Honorable Prince Kailash Leos, Dr. Marshall Emmanuel, Dr. Sharon Belmar George, Dr. Gerald Thompson, and Mr. Dylan Norbert Inglis. You brought balance to a subject often clouded by extremes. You honored the plant's history, examined its biology, confronted its risks, clarified its medical promise, and challenged us to think beyond stigma towards strategy. To our moderator, Mr. Kurt Harris, thank you for guiding the conversation with clarity and control. To our master of ceremony, Mr. Phil Henderson, you rolled with the punches and kept us on course. To the dedicated staff of the RSA, your hard work, dedication, and commitment is appreciated. And finally, to our specially invited guests and the audience in person or online, thank you. Merci. Muchas gracias. Dialogue only matters when people are willing to listen, to question, and to learn. Today demonstrated something powerful. St. Lucia is capable of mature, evidence-based, culturally aware conversations about regulated substances. That is progress. That is leadership. That is nation building. On behalf of the Regulated Substances Authority, thank you for being a part of Diving into the Weeds.